Imagine waking up in Victorian Britain. The air tastes faintly of coal, the streets are chaotic with horse traffic, and every newspaper headline screams a different moral panic. Yet despite the pollution, disease, and a general lack of hand-washing, Victorians walked around with the unwavering belief that perfect health was entirely achievable if one simply tried hard enough. And tried they did. In their minds, illness wasn't just unfortunate, it was suspicious. If you caught a cold, people didn't wonder whether you'd been standing in the rain. They wondered whether you'd been thinking too many gloomy thoughts. Because to Victorians, health was moral, illness was a personal failing, and nothing terrified them more than being perceived as morally weak. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. This obsession was fueled by a society that equated a healthy body with a healthy soul. Victorian wellness wasn't just about avoiding disease, it was about performing righteousness. You were expected to glow with the radiance of someone who always said their prayers, never had improper thoughts, and drank water that definitely did not contain cholera. Perfect health was both a medical ideal and a spiritual duty, an unattainable gold medal everyone was expected to win. If you didn't achieve it, well, clearly you weren't trying hard enough. In an era before antibiotics, reliable doctors, or even basic germ theory, Victorian people filled the gaps with sheer optimism and a touch of delusion. They believed that your state of mind could not only influence your health, but single-handedly determine it. If you remained cheerful, you could supposedly fend off nearly every illness known to humanity. Tuberculosis? Just smile through it. Chronic indigestion? Have you tried thinking happy thoughts? Melancholy? Take a brisk walk and pretend everything's fine. Victorians thought good health was a choice, like buttoning your coat or ignoring your child. This belief seeped into everything. Mothers instructed their children to maintain a sunny attitude, as though a sour mood might summon typhoid. Employers praised workers who never complained, no matter how close to collapsing they were. And the countless advice manuals warned readers that negative emotions could cloud the humours, invite disease, or, my personal favourite, dampen the sparkle of the lungs. What lungs were sparkling, no one ever explained. But Victorians were determined to keep theirs glittering. The wellness industry smelled opportunity. Perfect health was a product, a lifestyle, a promise tucked into every advertisement. Bookstores overflowed with guides on how to manage your emotions, posture, diet, and breathing. Not with medically proven insights, of course, but with elaborate philosophies written with absolute confidence and zero scientific grounding. One guide insisted that standing tall allowed purified air to strike the lungs like a blessing. Another recommended daily smiling exercises to strengthen the nervous system. A third suggested that moral weakness could be cured by eating a plain diet and avoiding spicy food, because apparently chili flakes were one step away from eternal damnation. Soon enough, entire social rituals revolved around appearing perfectly healthy. When guests visited, you greeted them with the vigour of someone who had just run a marathon, even if you'd only walked from the next room. A pale face was fashionable, but only a healthy pale, not the kind that suggested you might keel over before dessert. Men prided themselves on appearing robust and energetic. Women cultivated a fragile but wholesome glow that suggested innocence, not anemia. If you actually were sick, you smiled harder, because being visibly ill came with consequences. It could lower your marriage prospects, your job stability, your social standing, and your friends' willingness to sit next to you. Entire families went to absurd lengths to hide illness, sometimes claiming a sick relative was simply resting upstairs, while everyone nervously hoped they wouldn't cough loud enough to expose the truth. A family whose child looked too pale might quickly ship them to the countryside for fresh air. Not because it always worked, but because it looked like responsible parenting. This relentless pressure created a society of health performers. People walked faster, spoke cheerfully, took vigorous strolls in terrible weather, and pretended not to notice when their organs mutinied. Act healthy to be healthy became the silent national motto. Even Queen Victoria, famously not the picture of fitness, embodied the Victorian paradox. She praised discipline and moral purity while privately battling migraines, melancholy, and general exhaustion. But of course, no one dared discuss the monarch's less-than-perfect health. That would undermine the whole fantasy. The most ironic part? While Victorians obsessed over appearing healthy, they lived in an environment doing everything possible to sabotage them. London's air quality was so bad, chimney sweeps probably had clearer lungs. Water supplies carried diseases that could wipe out entire neighbourhoods. And food? Well, let's just say that if your bread didn't contain chalk, your sweets might have lead. Yet the public insisted that perfect health was within reach, as long as you smiled, walked briskly, and resisted the temptation to sneeze in public. The result was a culture vibrating with anxiety, ambition, and quiet terror, where everyone tried to out-healthy everyone else, and where wellness was more performance than reality. And this obsession laid the perfect foundation for all the bizarre, dangerous, and occasionally hilarious health trends that would follow in the decades to come. Step into a Victorian chemist's shop and you're entering a wonderland of health promises, a glittering maze of glass bottles, mysterious labels, and liquids in colours that nature never intended. Everywhere you look, something claims to cure something. A cough, easily fixed. A headache, gone in a sip. A broken heart, just drink 2 teaspoons and stop being dramatic. And the best part? None of these bottles required a prescription because technically no one knew what they were doing. The Victorian patent medicine industry was the Wild West. If the Wild West sold opium, alcohol, chloroform, and pure confidence in charming little bottles, Victorian patent medicines rose to fame because people were desperate. Imagine living in a time when your doctor might prescribe leeches, your water might give you cholera, and your neighbour might swear he was cured of gout by staring at a horse for 72 minutes. In this context, buying a miracle tonic seemed like the most rational decision of the century. It was cheap, it came with its own label art, and best of all, it tasted like something was happening. Mostly because the moment you swallowed it, something was happening, and usually it involved your vision blurring. These tonics weren't called patent medicines because they held patents. Most didn't. The word patent was just a fancy marketing trick, implying legitimacy where there was none. Anyone with a wooden crate and a sense of mischief could create a tonic, slap a label on it, and declare it approved by science. Science, in this case, being a 3-paragraph testimonial written by someone named Mrs. Good Health of Manchester, who either didn't exist or had been bribed with a free bottle. The ingredients? A delightful cocktail of substances that would spark a modern-day lawsuit faster than you could say, drink responsibly. Alcohol was the base ingredient, not just a splash, but sometimes up to 60% alcohol by volume. One sip cured your headache, your sadness, and your ability to walk straight. Many mothers unknowingly fed their children tonics that were stronger than modern whiskey, proudly announcing that the little ones were finally sleeping soundly, which of course they were. Then came the opium, a miracle drug the Victorians called it, and miracle it was. It miraculously erased your worries, your appetite, your sense of time, and occasionally your pulse. Opium-infused syrups were advertised as soothing, which was accurate, if by soothing you meant temporarily removing your existence from your physical body. Adults loved them. Children loved them. Anyone conscious enough to swallow loved them. Even babies got their own special blends, gently marketed to exhausted mothers as quietness in a bottle. But why stop at opium and alcohol? Some patent medicine makers tossed in chloroform, turpentine, ammonia, cocaine, or various herbs they found lying around. Entire formulas were created through guesswork. Does chloroform cure migraines, as someone wondered? Well, it certainly makes you forget about them, came the reply. And into the bottle it went. Victorian advertising only made matters more entertaining. Labels promised cures for ailments that modern doctors would raise an eyebrow at. "Restores vigour," proclaimed one tonic. "Strengthens the blood," shouted another. "Eliminates female troubles. announced a third without ever explaining what female troubles were or why anyone needed alcohol-laced opium to fix them. Sketches on the bottles featured glowing men sprinting up hills, radiant women holding flowers, and cherubic children with the eyes suggesting they had definitely consumed something stronger than orange juice. What made patent medicines unstoppable was their accessibility. They didn't require a doctor, a diagnosis, or even a real illness. People bought them for headaches, colds, heartbreaks, and days when they simply didn't like their neighbour. Travelling salesmen roamed the countryside preaching the gospel of guaranteed cure-alls, performing dramatic demonstrations like holding up cured testimonials or offering free samples that provided instant euphoria for reasons never disclosed. And Victorians believed. They believed because they wanted to. Life was a constant battle against disease, exhaustion, and questionable sanitation. When someone handed you a bottle that promised relief, you didn't ask questions. You opened it. If it burned going down, that meant it was working. If it made you see double, that meant it was really working. Yet the trade had a darker side. Many became dependent on these tonics, not realizing they were effectively consuming industrial-strength cocktails disguised as medicine. Addiction spread quietly, disguised as good health. People carried their favourite remedies everywhere, in pockets, in handbags, in bedside drawers. Entire households ran on a rotation of stimulants and sedatives, with families taking morning tonics to invigorate and evening tonics to quiet the nerves. It was a nation held together by lace, etiquette, and undisclosed narcotics. Despite growing concerns, it took decades before anyone seriously challenged the patent medicine industry. When early scientists finally examined the contents, their reactions ranged from horrified to impressed. How, they asked Amoy, did anyone survive the Victorian era at all? The answer, perhaps, lies in the same bottles that endangered them. They were too intoxicated to notice. As the century progressed, public trust slowly eroded, but not before patent medicines left an unforgettable mark on history. They shaped consumer culture, influenced advertising, and taught future generations a valuable lesson. If a bottle promises to cure everything, it probably cures nothing, except maybe boredom. In the grand catalogue of Victorian beauty standards, where fainting was fashionable, ribs were negotiable, and modesty was considered a workout routine, nothing captures the era's shimmering blend of ambition and catastrophe quite like arsenic beauty wafers. Yes, arsenic. The same substance used to discreetly remove inconvenient husbands and troublesome heirs was also eaten by perfectly respectable ladies hoping to achieve that coveted, ethereal glow. Because if there's one thing Victorians loved more than appearing healthy, it was appearing delicately unhealthy in a socially acceptable way. Arsenic in the Victorian mind possessed a magical quality. It could turn your complexion pale, smooth, and faintly luminous, the sort of look that suggested you were too gentle for this harsh world, too refined for sunlight, and possibly too close to fainting to stand without support. At a time when everything from coal smoke to hard labour threatened to give you an unflattering tan, pale skin signified privilege. If you looked ghostly, you weren't sick, you were fashionable. The beauty industry saw an opportunity and seized it with both toxic, trembling hands. By the mid-1800s, arsenic complexion wafers appeared in advertisements promising a miraculous transformation. Clearer skin, a lighter tone, and a radiance most pleasing to the eye. Never mind that the radiance was partly due to the fact that arsenic interfered with your red blood cell production. Minor details. What mattered was the promise. Victorians didn't just want to be beautiful, they wanted to be beautiful in a way that proved their moral, social, and economic superiority. And nothing says beauty like nibbling a substance also used to politely murder people. These wafers came in little neatly packaged tins, often decorated with floral designs or dainty lettering. They were marketed as sophisticated, luxurious treatments, the kind of indulgence one might hide in a vanity drawer alongside perfume bottles, love letters, and secrets. Women were advised to take them daily like vitamins, only significantly more dangerous. Some guides recommended starting with small doses to build tolerance, as though practicing with poison was a charming hobby. Manufacturers insisted the arsenic was purified or refined, or, my personal favourite, safe for cosmetic use. This was a bold claim considering the era's understanding of chemistry could be summarised as, if it looks pretty, it's probably fine. And people believed it. Why? Because they trusted advertisements more than doctors, and sometimes more than God. The effects of arsenic wafers varied wildly. Some users swore by them, insisting their skin truly did appear smoother and more even. Others experienced symptoms that would alarm modern readers: numbness, nausea, hair loss, swelling, and a charming little condition known as arsenic breath, which could politely be described as a hint of the grave. But these discomforts were often brushed aside as adjustments or purifying reactions. After all, beauty demanded sacrifice, preferably not your life. But Victorians weren't picky. Even men were not immune to the allure of arsenic. Gentlemen consumed their own versions of the wafers to achieve a smoother complexion or reduce visible blemishes. After all, in many social circles, a gentleman's face was seen as an extension of his reputation, ideally showing confidence, discipline, and only a moderate amount of existential despair. Arsenic promised a shortcut to grooming standards no razor or cold bath could achieve. But arsenic wasn't just eaten. It appeared in soaps, lotions, face powders, and even complexion water. A person could cleanse their skin with arsenic, moisturise their skin with arsenic, and then finish the routine by swallowing a wafer of arsenic, essentially creating a 3-step skincare routine from the toxic waste bin. Some products went so far as to boast that their arsenic content was what gave them their unique effectiveness, as if consumers should feel grateful for receiving such a premium ingredient. To be fair, the Victorians did attempt to set some boundaries. Newspapers occasionally published warnings about dangerous complexion remedies after someone fainted dramatically at a tea party or developed strange blotches on their skin. Doctors, the ones who had begun warming up to germ theory instead of bloodletting, tried to tell people that ingesting poison might not be ideal. But society had already decided that beauty was a battlefield, and arsenic wafers were the sparkly grenades. Discouraging their use was like discouraging corsets, logical yet utterly ignored. In rural areas, arsenic took on a different twist. Some communities, particularly in parts of Austria and northern England, consumed arsenic as a folk remedy, believing small doses strengthened the lungs and enhanced physical endurance. These arsenic eaters became local legends, capable of climbing mountains with astonishing stamina. Travellers and writers were fascinated, treating these individuals as exotic curiosities. Their glowing skin and surprising vitality seemed to defy medical explanation, though today it's understood that slow, gradual exposure can create limited tolerance. Still toxic, mind you, just slightly slower at killing you. The arsenic beauty craze began to fade toward the late 19th century, partly because medical science finally caught up, and partly because too many people had begun exhibiting side effects too dramatic to ignore. Beauty magazines shifted towards safer suggestions, like lemon juice, oatmeal, or simply carrying a parasol and avoiding the sun, a technique notably less fatal. Arsenic gradually returned to its rightful place, locked in cabinets, used in laboratories, and occasionally starring in crime novels. Yet the legacy of arsenic wafers didn't disappear. They stand as a shining example of the Victorian motto, "If it promises beauty, who cares if it quietly kills you?" A reminder that the history of cosmetics is often less glamorous than the results they claim to produce. And perhaps most importantly, a warning that humans have always been willing to risk almost anything, except giving up a questionable beauty trend. If you thought eating arsenic wafers was the peak of Victorian health chaos, allow me to introduce the luminous disaster that arrived next: Radium water. The drink that promised vitality, vigour, and possibly immortality, all while quietly preparing your bones for early retirement. Before people understood that radiation was less healing glow and more slow-motion explosion inside your cells, Victorians and early Edwardians embraced radium-infused beverages with the enthusiasm of children discovering candy. It didn't make you healthier, but it absolutely made your bones reconsider their life choices. To understand how this glowing trend took hold, you must remember that Victorians loved anything that felt modern, scientific, or vaguely magical. Electricity? Amazing. Telegraphs? Miraculous. Photography? Witchcraft they approved of. So when radium was discovered in 1898 by Marie and Pierre Curie, the world erupted with excitement. Here was a substance that glowed in the dark, heated itself, and seemed to defy every known law of nature. Basically the Victorian equivalent of discovering a real-life superhero. But while scientists cautiously studied radium through thick glass and proper containment, entrepreneurs were already rubbing their hands together. A glowing chemical that people didn't understand? Perfect. It was time to bottle it, brand it, and sell it as a health drink. Radium water, sometimes called radium tonic, radiant elixir, or liquid sunshine, entered the market promising everything from renewed energy to restored youth. Advertisements boasted that it could awaken the cells, stimulate vitality, and restore the spark of life. Ironic, considering it was actually destroying those cells, overstimulating them into panic, and adding an entirely different kind of spark deep in your marrow. Victorians didn't just drink the stuff, they celebrated it. Magazines published glowing testimonials in more ways than one, praising the beverage as the discovery of the century. Wealthy households kept decorative bottles on display, as if radioactive water were as elegant as fine wine. Some even offered it to dinner guests as a luxury experience. Would you like more pudding? Another sip of the glowing death potion? A classy evening all around, but what did radium water taste like? According to surviving descriptions, it was metallic, energizing, and slightly electric, which are not usually words one wants associated with hydration. Still, people chugged it eagerly, believing the tingling sensation meant it was working. In a sense it was, just not in any way they intended. Manufacturers made increasingly bold claims. One brand insisted it could fortify the blood with energizing rays. Another promoted itself as the cure for sluggish minds, tired spirits, and general malaise. A third advertised radium water as the secret weapon against aging, as if drinking radioactive isotopes was just a quirky form of skincare. Doctors jumped onto the trend too. Some prescribed radium beverages for arthritis, poor digestion, depression, and even boredom. Physicians earnestly believed that since radium emitted heat and energy, it must stimulate the human body in positive ways. This was Victorian logic. If something glows unnaturally, swallow it. To capitalize on the excitement, companies branched out into related products. There were radium chocolates, radium butter, radium toothpaste, radium suppositories. The less said about these, the better. And even radium cosmetics for women who wanted their cheeks to glow, hopefully just metaphorically. The trend was everywhere, embraced with the same unshakable confidence that brought the world corsets shaped like hourglasses and furniture made from taxidermy animals. One of the strangest creations was the radium water generator, a countertop device that let you make glowing water at home. It looked like a fancy teapot filled with uranium ore, which uses filtered water through to absorb life-giving radiations. These devices were marketed as modern health appliances, the Victorian equivalent of owning an expensive blender, except instead of making smoothies, it made you radioactive. Of course, problems soon emerged. People began experiencing symptoms that no tonic label mentioned: jaw pain, tooth loss, strange bone issues, fatigue, and a general sense that their skeleton was quietly dissolving. But Victorians were tough. They called these symptoms adjustments or temporary reactions, the same way arsenic wafer fans shrugged off fainting as a normal side effect. If your jaw hurt, maybe it meant the water was strengthening your constitution. If your bones ached, perhaps they were purifying themselves. If your teeth fell out, well, Victorian dentistry wasn't great anyway. The real devastation became unmistakable only as heavy users suffered severe, irreversible damage. Bones became brittle, organs weakened, and jaws literally crumbled, a condition later nicknamed radium jaw. For those who drank the tonics regularly, their bodies accumulated radiation like tiny glowing time bombs. Some of these individuals became so radioactive that even after death, their remains stayed mildly luminous. By the early 20th century, scientists finally connected the dots. Radiation was not a gentle stimulant, it was a microscopic wrecking ball. The glamorous radium water craze dissolved almost overnight as people realized the spark of life was actually a spark of cellular destruction. Yet despite the tragedy, the fascination with radium lingered. Even as the dangers became clear, some continued to believe in its healing powers. To them, radium wasn't a poison, it was modernity distilled into a glass. A future you could swallow, a miracle that simply required a little adjustment. Radium water remains one of history's most spectacular health missteps, a glowing symbol of the Victorian belief that if something looked miraculous, it must be healthy, and if it came in elegant packaging, even better. The Victorian pursuit of vitality had once again crossed boldly into the territory where common sense feared to tread. Imagine walking into a Victorian doctor's office with a mild fever, a headache, or simply a bad mood. Before you could even finish listing your symptoms, the physician was already rolling up his sleeves and reaching for his favourite medical tool, a knife, or a lancet, or a set of delightful brass leeches kept in a jar that smelled like regret. To Victorians, bloodletting wasn't just a treatment, it was the treatment. The all-purpose, one-size-fits-all solution for everything from infections to indigestion to the existential dread of living in the 19th century. Victorian medicine, when in doubt, remove a pint. Bloodletting had been around for thousands of years, but Victorians brought it into the 19th century with the same boundless enthusiasm they applied to nearly every questionable idea. The belief was simple. Too much blood meant too much energy, too much heat, too much humour, too much something. Doctors didn't always agree on what the blood was doing wrong, but they did agree that taking some out would probably help. This was the era of heroic medicine, a form of treatment that was heroic in the sense that the patient needed tremendous bravery to endure it. The process itself was shockingly casual. You might arrive complaining of dizziness, and the doctor would say, "Ah yes, classic excess blood syndrome," as though this were a well-known condition. Out came the lancet, sharpened with ceremonial flourish. A shallow cut was made in the arm, and a bowl was placed beneath to catch the escaping life force. Some doctors preferred placing the bowl somewhere visible, so patients could admire their own healing as it left their body. Nothing says reassurance like watching yourself drain into a salad-sized dish. For more serious conditions, or for doctors who simply enjoyed commitment, multiple cuts might be made at once. Some practitioners worked with such speed and confidence that patients barely had time to ask, "So, should I be sitting down?" before nearly passing out. Others believed bloodletting should be done gradually and elegantly, like opening a vintage wine. And then there were those who favoured the leech approach, the natural method, as they called it. Leeches were the Victorian version of a reusable medical device, stored in jars of murky water. They were sold in apothecaries by the handful, squirming with professional ambition. A skilled doctor could recommend leeches for nearly any ailment: swollen joints, sore throats, acne, grief, excessive excitement, or simply looking a bit too pink in the face. Women, especially, were considered ideal candidates for leech therapy. Doctors insisted leeches were gentler, a description no one who has ever seen a leech in action would confidently repeat. The application was an art. The doctor would carefully place the creature on the patient's skin, encouraging it to latch on. A good leech might drink several times its own weight in blood before politely falling off satisfied. Some doctors rotated leeches between patients, claiming this increased their efficiency, a word here meaning risking transferring something horrifying but pretending it's fine. Households were even encouraged to keep leeches on hand, the way we keep band-aids today. A family might write in a housekeeping journal, flour, sugar, candles, and 6 fresh leeches before Sunday. What made bloodletting truly astonishing wasn't just its popularity, but its persistence. Even as medical knowledge improved, many Victorian doctors clung to bleeding with the stubborn devotion of a person refusing to update their phone's operating system. If a patient worsened, some physicians blamed the patient for not having had enough blood removed. "We must continue the treatment," they would declare, as everyone else in the room wondered whether the patient had any blood left. And the patients? Some embraced the procedure with unsettling enthusiasm. In an age where illness felt mysterious and frightening, bloodletting offered a clear physical ritual that seemed to promise immediate action. You could see something happening. You could also feel something happening, specifically dizziness, weakness, and a sudden desire to lie down and reconsider your choices. But Victorians loved sensation-based medicine. If the treatment hurt or made you lightheaded, that meant it must be working. Of course, there were mishaps. Overzealous bleeding sessions led to fainting spells, convulsions, or in tragic cases, a hasty funeral. Some doctors misjudged how much blood a person could lose, especially during epidemics when they treated multiple patients in rapid succession. There were documented cases where patients were bled so aggressively that attempting to stand afterward was an Olympic-level challenge. Eventually, better science began dismantling the practice. As germ theory emerged and anatomy became better understood, physicians realized that draining patients like household plumbing wasn't improving outcomes. Journals began publishing articles delicately titled things like, "Perhaps we should bleed less often." Others were less polite, bloodletting, a practice in need of immediate burial. But while the elite medical community slowly let go, the general public held on a bit longer. Old habits died hard, especially the ones that required draining you first. By the late Victorian era, bloodletting had mostly faded into history, replaced by less medieval approaches. The lancets were packed away, the leeches retired or escaped into rivers to terrorize fish, and future generations looked back in bewilderment. How had such a dramatic, risky practice persisted for so long? The answer lies in the Victorian mindset. Health was something you fought for, physically, dramatically, and with great ceremony. Bloodletting fit that worldview perfectly, bold, immediate, and satisfying in the most alarming way possible. Picture yourself waking up in Victorian Britain as a fashionable woman. Before breakfast, before tea, before even deciding whether life is worth living today. You must face your first and most formidable task. Putting on your corset. This was not a garment. This was not an accessory. This was a full-body negotiation with physics, oxygen, and your own internal organs. Tight lacing, the practice of pulling corset strings to the point where your waist could double as an hourglass-shaped pencil holder, was not just popular. It was an obsession. Nothing boosts confidence like knowing your spleen is now folded in half. Corsets had existed long before the Victorian era, but it was the 9th century that transformed them into rigid architectural masterpieces. They were engineered with whale baleen, steel ribs, cotton, silk, and dreams of a waist so tiny it could cause bystanders to gasp, or faint, depending on how tightly they themselves were laced. Victorians believed beauty and morality went hand in hand, so a well-shaped waist wasn't just attractive, it signified discipline, restraint, and the ability to withstand prolonged discomfort without complaining. In short, it was the perfect Victorian value system stitched into fabric. The tight lacing trend intensified during the mid-1800s, when fashion magazines began printing illustrations of women shaped like elegant, elongated question marks. Wide skirts, enormous sleeves, and dramatic silhouettes made it look as if the human torso existed purely to provide structural support. To achieve that shape, women pulled their laces tighter and tighter, chasing the fabled ideal waist, which hovered somewhere around 18 to 20 inches, a measurement better suited for small dogs than humans. Doctors occasionally issued warnings, but their voices were drowned out by fashion advice columns promising life-changing transformations. One insisted that a properly shaped corset improved posture, digestion, and general character. Another claimed it prevented female mischief, a delightfully vague term that likely meant breathing freely and making choices. Some physicians even argued that corsets supported weak abdominal muscles, conveniently forgetting that muscles tended to weaken because corsets did all the work. What actually happened inside the body was less poetic. When laced tightly enough, the corset compressed the rib cage, forcing the lower ribs inward and upward. Organs shifted like startled tenants asked to move apartments without notice. The liver tilted, the stomach relocated, and the intestines rearranged themselves into a configuration never illustrated in medical textbooks. Breathing became shallow because the diaphragm had approximately 2 inches of wiggle room. Women walked stiffly, sat carefully, and climbed stairs at the speed of a melancholic ghost. Yet many insisted they felt perfectly fine. And they meant it. In the same way someone who's been sitting on their foot for 20 minutes insists the numbness is normal. After all, if you had worn a corset since childhood, you didn't remember a time when your ribs weren't politely squeezed. Girls as young as 5 or 6 were introduced to training corsets, the idea being that a waist wasn't something you grew with, it was something you moulded like clay, and if the clay had thoughts about it, well, it wasn't consulted. Corsets also shaped social behaviour. Women wore them for every occasion, walking, sitting, shopping, fainting, even exercising, which mostly meant stretching gracefully without disturbing the furniture. The amount of time spent inside these garments was astonishing. Some women wore them for 12 to 16 hours straight, removing them only to sleep, assuming they weren't wearing a special nighttime corset designed to maintain one's figure during periods of rest. Yes, there were sleep corsets, because Victorians believed even your dreams should be hourglass-shaped. Then came the corset controversies. Newspapers published letters from concerned citizens, some claiming corsets caused shortness of breath and heart palpitations. Others insisted those symptoms were caused by women being emotional, dramatic, or exposed to overly exciting novels. Meanwhile, dress reformers, an early feminist group, declared corsets instruments of oppression. They argued that bodies did not need to be forcibly sculpted, and that breathing was, in fact, quite useful. Their movement gained traction, slowly, very slowly, because fashion magazines immediately counterattacked with the claim that abandoning corsets was ungentlemanly, unladylike, and unthinkable. Despite criticism, tight lacing blossomed into one of the century's most enduring style battles. Some women even pursued waist training, gradually reducing their measurements over months or years. A few extreme cases boasted waists under 15 inches, measurements viewed today with the same awe and concern one might reserve for someone who casually lifts pianos for fun. Yet corsets weren't all torture. Many women genuinely loved them. They believed corsets helped support heavy dresses, improved posture, and gave them confidence. In an era where appearance determined social survival, the corset became a symbol of control, ironically achieved through physical restriction. Comfort was secondary to beauty, breathability was negotiable, and internal organ placement was apparently optional. By the end of the Victorian era, corset designs began shifting. More flexible materials appeared, doctors raised louder objections, and changing fashions reduced the demand for extreme waistlines. But the legacy of the corset, both glamorous and grotesque, remained deeply woven into the fabric of fashion history. Victorian corsets weren't just garments, they were statements. They declared, "I am elegant, disciplined, respectable, and I haven't taken a full breath since breakfast." If you ever feel like modern detox trends are going a little too far, allow me to take you by the hand and lead you gently or violently into the world of Victorian purging culture. This was the era when the human body was not seen as a carefully balanced system, but as a clogged pipe that needed frequent, enthusiastic clearing. And nothing embodied this philosophy more than the Victorian obsession with purging through mercury pills, jalap root, calomel, castor oil, and any substance that could encourage the body to dramatically empty itself. Victorians believed anything could be fixed by violently evacuating the body. To understand how such chaos became mainstream, You have to remember the Victorian medical worldview. Illness wasn't caused by bacteria or viruses, those were radical ideas. No, sickness in their minds was caused by impurities, mucked humours, or simply internal sluggishness. And if something was sluggish, the obvious Victorian solution was to forcefully speed it up until it resembled a natural disaster. Enter mercury, specifically calomel, a mercury chloride compound that doctors praised as the ultimate purifier. Calomel was prescribed for digestive problems, headaches, melancholy, and even vague conditions like the vapors or a troubled constitution. You could walk into a doctor's office complaining of a mild cough and leave with a jar of mercury pills so strong that your gums would begin to dissolve before your symptoms did. Doctors adored calomel. They praised it in journals, prescribed it liberally, and treated it like a cure-all. To them, the side effects, tooth loss, mouth ulcers, neurological damage, tremors, and occasionally full-body collapse, were simply signs that the medicine was taking effect. If your teeth fell out, that meant the impurities were definitely leaving. If you couldn't hold a pencil anymore, perhaps you were holding too tightly onto your toxins. Patients, meanwhile, complied with almost religious devotion. Some families took calomel weekly, not because they were sick, but because they believed purging prevented sickness. It was the ancestor of the routine cleanse, except instead of sipping a green smoothie, you swallowed a substance that would horrify any chemist today. Entire households purged together, bonding through shared suffering and synchronized digestive despair. And calomel was only the beginning. Victorian purging culture included jalap root, a powerful herbal laxative imported from Mexico. Jalap was marketed as natural and therefore safe, a marketing technique still recognizable today. But jalap wasn't subtle. It didn't gently encourage digestion. It declared war on it. Jalap was known to cause cramps so severe people clutched tables for support, and its effects were described by one contemporary as thunderous. Yet it remained wildly popular, especially among the upper classes, who believed discomfort proved the treatment's moral seriousness. Then there was castor oil, perhaps the most infamous Victorian cure-all. Mothers administered castor oil to children with the same unwavering confidence with which they scolded them. If a child sneezed wrong, castor oil. If they looked tired, castor oil. If they made too much noise at church, castor oil. Children were basically one misbehaviour away from a full gastrointestinal cleanse. Books from the period praised castor oil for its purifying properties, though they neglected to mention the taste, a flavour that resembled something between liquefied regret and oily despair. Children dreaded the spoon, and many tried hiding under beds upon hearing the bottle pop open. Parents, however, remained unmoved. Suffering was part of growing up, and if it resulted in a cleaner intestinal tract, all the better. Mercury, jalap, castor oil. These were the stars of Victorian purging, but they weren't alone. There were purgative salts, powders, syrups, and even tonics that promised to expel accumulated wastes with the enthusiasm of a marching band. Mixing purgatives was not uncommon. Some individuals took combinations that would send a modern ER into a panic. One popular remedy mixed calomel with jalap and claimed to activate both the liver and bowel simultaneously, a phrase that should strike fear into even the bravest reader. What made all this worse was the fact that Victorians judged each other by their purging habits. A person who regularly engaged in internal cleansing was seen as responsible and health-conscious. Someone who refused purgatives might be labelled lazy, reckless, or suspiciously cheerful. Social pressure convinced thousands to participate in rituals that made them miserable, dehydrated, and occasionally delirious, but never ever impure. Doctors defended this culture with impressive confidence. They published case studies celebrating the successful evacuation of 8 pounds of matter, written with the pride of a fisherman describing his biggest catch. Medical textbooks included enthusiastic charts about how many times a person should purge per month. Some even recommended increasing the dosage during winter, when the humours grow sluggish. Despite mounting evidence that mercury was harmful, many physicians refused to abandon calomel until the late Victorian period. Some worried their reputations would suffer if they admitted their favourite treatment was essentially poison. Others sincerely believed that the most dramatic treatments were the most effective. Subtlety was not a Victorian medical virtue. The purging mania only began to fade as germ theory improved and medical science started connecting symptoms with causes instead of metaphors. Slowly, physicians realised that violently emptying a person's digestive system wasn't solving underlying problems. And the public, noticing that fewer purged people were unexpectedly collapsing, began embracing gentler cures. Today, the Victorian purging craze stands as one of history's clearest examples of how confidently humans can be wrong when it comes to health. It also proves that the desire to cleanse the body has ancient roots, though few modern detoxes involve substances that can loosen your teeth. If you ever complained about being cold in Victorian Britain, the response you'd likely hear wasn't "put on a sweater," but "excellent, let's make you colder." Because in the 19th century, cold water wasn't just water, it was medicine, morality, punishment, and character development, all in one unpleasant splash. The Victorians firmly believed that freezing baths cured melancholy, misbehaviour, overexcitement, and any other human emotion that inconvenienced adults. Step 1. Feel sad. Step 2. Jump into water that convinces you death is imminent. To the Victorian mind, cold water was nature's strictest disciplinarian. While warm baths were seen as luxurious, soft, and morally suspect, and warm water loosened muscles, after all, and who knows what else it might loosen, cold water was bracing, invigorating, and above all obedience-inducing. Nothing snapped a person back into line like plunging them into a tub that felt 1 degree removed from glacier runoff. The obsession began with the rise of hydropathy, a movement claiming that water alone could cure everything from sadness to stomach pain. But Victorian hydropathy had a twist: the colder the better. Doctors believed cold water shocked the system into balance, which is a poetic way of describing a full-body panic response. Hydrotherapists prescribed cold baths the way others prescribed rest, frequently, confidently, and without a shred of hesitation. For adults, cold baths were marketed as invigorating health boosters. Manuals advised immersing oneself each morning for clarity of mind and firmness of spirit, though clarity was mostly achieved by screaming internally and trying not to black out. Women were told that cold bathing would improve complexion, posture, and moral fibre. Men were told it would build stamina, vigour, and masculine fortitude, a phrase that conveniently ignored the fact that freezing water made most men shriek like startled birds. But the true victims of the cold bath cure were children. Victorian parents and teachers, armed with a near supernatural confidence in their parenting techniques, used cold baths to address a wide range of childhood crimes. Whining, sulking, playing too loudly, playing too quietly, and existing in a manner that suggested insufficient gratitude. Schools routinely administered cold baths for discipline, occasionally waking students before dawn and marching them outside to plunge into icy troughs. These moral baths, as some called them, were thought to build character, reduce laziness, and discourage improper behaviours, which basically meant any behaviour not involving silence and perfect posture. Doctors supported the trend wholeheartedly. Many warned that children who avoided cold baths would grow weak-spirited, nervous, or worst of all, prone to imagination. The Victorian fear of imagination cannot be overstated. If cold water could drown creativity, so much the better. The practice wasn't limited to homes and schools. Cold baths were institutionalized in asylums, prisons, workhouses, and even some hospitals. Whether they were used as treatment for a staggering list of conditions: hysteria, melancholy, overthinking, excitable nerves, and refusing to behave impressively when visitors arrived. Patients were sometimes repeatedly dunked in icy water or placed in cold plunges for extended periods, the idea being that nothing calmed an unsettled mind like feeling as if you were about to perish. Doctors kept meticulous notes, writing things like "patient improved after vigorous cold immersion," which translated to "patient agreed to behave if we promise not to do that again." Some asylums had massive cold water tubs designed specifically for this purpose. Deep, unheated, and filled with the kind of water temperature normally reserved for fish that enjoy suffering. Rich Victorians took the trend further, travelling to cold water spas where the wealthy voluntarily endured freezing immersions, icy showers, and wet sheet wraps so frigid your soul tried to leave your body. Spa owners marketed these treatments as luxurious purification rituals, though luxury is a generous word for being wrapped like a damp burrito and left on a wooden table until one repented of all emotional attachments. At home, the cold bath cure blended into daily routine. Many Victorian households kept cold tubs in bedrooms or washrooms, filled each morning with water that could shock an elephant into contemplation. Some families insisted that children bathe in rivers year-round, regardless of weather, because nothing said good upbringing like emerging from water with lips so blue you match the winter sky. People wrote heartfelt testimonies about how cold baths transform their lives. I feel renewed, one might claim, leaving out the part where they momentarily lost vision after the plunge. Strengthened, another, insisted, admitting that they'd lost feeling in their extremities. Some even swore that cold bathing cured illnesses, heartbreak and moral confusion. It wasn't so much that cold baths healed, more that after enduring the shock, everything else in life felt manageable by comparison. Criticism eventually emerged, especially as modern medicine grew skeptical of treatments that relied primarily on terrifying the patient. Doctors began questioning whether inducing hypothermia was actually beneficial. Some noted that constant cold bathing worsened respiratory illnesses, caused heart strain, and made children fear mornings. But tradition dies hard, especially when it feels righteous. Many clung to cold baths as a symbol of discipline, health, and proper upbringing. By the end of the Victorian era, the cold bath cure had softened, but never disappeared. Even today, cold plunges remain a wellness trend, though modern enthusiasts call it biohacking instead of preventing moral decay. Cold baths stand as a quintessential Victorian remedy, dramatic, uncomfortable, unwaveringly confident, and only mildly connected to actual health. Why soothe a troubled mind when you can freeze it into obedience? If there is one thing Victorians loved more than moral lectures and decorative ferns, it was electricity. Mysterious, powerful, and absolutely perfect for wildly unsafe home use. Electricity was new, exciting, and barely understood, which of course made it the ideal ingredient for a booming health craze. The result? A glorious parade of electroshock contraptions promising renewed youth, restored vigour, improved digestion, cured nerves, and, most hilariously, a heightened masculinity. It was like owning a taser, except it came with a user manual and deep shame. Electricity in the Victorian imagination was pure cosmic energy, a life force bottled by science and offered to anyone brave enough to strap themselves into a buzzing belt. The public believed electricity could reawaken tired flesh, stimulate dormant vitality, and even restore failing spirits, which is poetic language for zap yourself and hope something happens. It didn't matter that no one knew exactly how it worked. That was part of the fun. If electricity illuminated cities and powered trolleys, surely it could also fix your lower back pain and your midlife crisis. Thus, the era's great invention spree began. Electric belts, electric brushes, electric socks, electric corsets, and galvanic necklaces designed to jolt your neck into better posture. But the real stars were the electric belts, marketed mostly, though not exclusively, to men. Advertisements declared these belts could restore masculinity, strengthen vital functions, and cure manly weakness, a phrase Victorian marketers wielded like a psychological weapon. Every belt promised to reinvigorate the system, though the system usually responded by twitching uncomfortably. These belts didn't plug into walls. Household electricity wasn't widely available yet. Instead, they used galvanic cells, small chemical batteries sewn directly into the fabric or attached through metal plates. When worn, the belt produced a continuous mild shock, like being politely electrocuted all day long. Some belts delivered steady current. Others pulsed unpredictably, giving the wearer a surprise jolt whenever they bent over, sat down too fast, or tried to make peace with their life choices. Men bought these belts in droves, driven partly by curiosity and partly by late-night insecurity triggered by Victorian advertisements that subtly implied your masculinity would shrivel into dust if you didn't electrify it immediately. Some belts even featured metal attachments designed to deliver jolts to particularly important areas, supposedly increasing virility. The number of men who regretted buying these belts is unknown, but historical science suggests many did. Women were not left out of the shock-based joy. They had electric corsets, electric bus developers, and electric massage wands promising to reawaken feminine vitality. These devices targeted nervous exhaustion, a condition Victorian doctors diagnosed frequently, usually because women were tired of wearing 30 pounds of clothing and pretending not to have opinions. The electric devices claimed to soothe nerves and restore balance, though what they mostly restored was the realization that being electrocuted was somehow still preferable to an afternoon with a Victorian physician. And then there were the chairs, electric chairs, not the prison kind, but vibrating health chairs, appeared in wealthier homes and spas. They were built from heavy wood and brass, with wires running through the seat and back. The user sat down, flipped a switch, and waited for a wave of tingling energy to surge gently or violently through their spine. These chairs claimed to stimulate circulation, though in practice they mostly stimulated shouting, flinching, and the sudden discovery of new swear words. Electric brushes promised to reawaken hair follicles through light electroshock. Advertising illustrations showed men with lush, heroic moustaches brushing their hair with smug confidence. The reality was often more chaotic. If the current was too strong, the brush delivered an unexpected snap to the scalp, sending users lunging backwards like startled cats. But Victorians were stubborn, and if the brush hurt, that meant it was working. Even household pets were not safe. Some companies sold electric collars for dogs, claiming they improved vitality and obedience. The fact that obedience increased when you shocked the dog did not occur to anyone as a moral concern. The problem was that all these devices were unregulated and, in many cases, invented by people who barely understood electricity themselves. Some belts corroded because the batteries leaked. Some chairs overheated. Some devices simply didn't work at all, unless you count providing a placebo effect wrapped in mild electrocution as working. And some, of course, shocked users so strongly that they were sent stumbling into furniture, reconsidering their commitment to modern technology. Yet Victorians trusted electricity because it felt new and scientific. It looked futuristic, and even when it hurt, at least it hurt in a modern way. People in the 1800s were accustomed to treatments involving leeches, bleeding, poison, and freezing baths. An electric jolt almost seemed civilized by comparison. The devices also offered something incredibly rare in Victorian healthcare: control. Instead of sitting through a lecture from a doctor or drinking yet another mystery tonic, you could strap on your belt, sit in your chair, or brush your hair, and feel like you were actively participating in your own wellness journey, although that journey frequently involved sparks. By the end of the century, as electrical theory improved, many of the most absurd devices quietly disappeared, replaced by safer technology and better medical understanding. But the Victorian dream of electrified vitality never fully died. Today's muscle stimulators, pulse massagers, and electric fitness belts are the direct descendants of those early contraptions, though thankfully modern versions come with safety standards and do not claim to cure melancholy or restore masculinity in 30 minutes a day. But the Victorians didn't know that. All they knew was that electricity buzzed, tingled, and felt like the future, even if that future involved shocking yourself while trying to read the newspaper. If the Victorians had a national sport, it wasn't cricket, fencing, or fainting. It was being terrified of body fat. Nothing struck fear into the 19th century soul quite like the idea of appearing even slightly plump. Forget illness, forget contaminated water, forget the constant threat of horse-related accidents, Fat was the true enemy. Victorians feared fat more than they feared their own doctors, and honestly, fair. This anxiety didn't sprout naturally. It had a celebrity origin story, and his name was Lord Byron. The Romantic poet didn't just write moody verses and cause emotional havoc in every salon he entered. He also pioneered one of history's earliest celebrity diet crazes, a legacy he probably never intended but would absolutely brag about. Byron was famously obsessed with staying thin, a fact he discussed with the theatrical self-pity in letters and journals. When he felt he had gained too much, which sometimes meant gaining a single kilogram, he put himself on aggressive slimming regimens that made later Victorians take notes with trembling admiration. His methods? Vinegar. Dramatic quantities of vinegar. Byron believed vinegar cleansed the body, suppressed appetite, and purified the soul, or at least helped him maintain his brooding, ghostly aesthetic. He often consumed little more than water, tea, biscuits, and vinegar mixtures. The man treated meals like inconveniences. Naturally, the public copied him. If Britain had social media back then, every young aristocrat would have been posting blurry daguerreotypes captioned #vinegar cleanse. But Byron wasn't the only force feeding the fear of fat. The Victorian era was obsessed with classification, measuring, sorting, ranking, and judging every aspect of humanity. Railways made travel easier, cameras captured forms, medical journals fixated on ideal proportions. Suddenly, people were comparing themselves not only to friends or neighbours, but to public figures, illustrations, and new beauty standards broadcast by magazines. A slim figure became shorthand for self-control, purity, and good breeding. Meanwhile, extra weight was associated unfairly with laziness, indulgence, or, worst of all, moral looseness. Thus the dieting craze began. Victorians invented a buffet of methods for avoiding the buffet. Starvation diets surged in popularity among middle and upper class women who wanted to maintain the fragile, ethereal appearance that fashion demanded. Doctors, some well-meaning, some absolutely not, prescribed strict eating plans meant to lighten the frame or refine the silhouette. Women skipped breakfast, half-skipped lunches, and ate dinners that could politely be described as symbolic. Some young women prided themselves on surviving entire days on nothing more than vinegar-infused water and a single pickled walnut. Appetite became a dirty word. Cookbooks printed dainty foods for ladies, a phrase that usually translated to tiny portions of steamed vegetables, weak broths, and the occasional whisper of boiled fish. Meanwhile, men were encouraged to be robust and hearty, but not too robust. Even they weren't immune to Byron's influence. Some adopted vinegar drinks to regulate the system, with newspapers offering helpful recipes such as vinegar lemonade, vinegar tea, and a horrifying invention called vinegar posset, which involved curdling milk with acidic brine. Doctors, in their usual Victorian confidence, contributed generously to the problem. Some warned women against eating too much bread, dairy, or meat, claiming it would disturb the nerves or broaden the frame. Others advised taking vigorous walks before meals to suppress hunger, ideally while wearing a corset, because nothing enhances exercise like reducing your lung capacity by 40%, and since nearly everything was believed to affect morality, diet was no exception. Gluttony was a sin, self-denial was virtuous. Eating too much food wasn't just unhealthy, it was suspicious. The vinegar fad blended seamlessly into this moral pressure. Vinegar was cheap, accessible, and, in large quantities, mildly nauseating, perfect for suppressing appetite. Some manuals recommended adding vinegar to every dish. Others called for vinegar baths, though these were less for weight loss and more for the general belief that vinegar cured absolutely anything if you stared at it long enough. Not all diets were vinegar-based. Some Victorians swore by lemon-only days, others by dry eating, where you avoided liquids entirely. One popular method involved chewing food until it became liquid and then swallowing only a portion. Another diet suggested eating exclusively at dawn and then avoiding all meals until sunrise the next day, a method we would now call intermittent fasting, if intermittent fasting were invented by someone who didn't like joy. Exercise regimens existed but tended towards extremes. Women were told to walk quickly but never run, stretch lightly but never strain, and breathe deeply but only if wearing a corset that prevented exactly that. Men experimented with calisthenics books that recommended push-ups, jumping drills, and posture exercises, always paired with strict diets designed to avoid excessive bulk. Victorian fitness culture wasn't about strength. It was about refinement. Looking strong was fine, looking thick was unacceptable. Still, the fear of fat had a dark side. Eating disorders quietly flourished, though they were rarely named or understood. Families often praised behaviours we now recognise as unhealthy. Skipping meals, obsessive weight checking, or refusing food at social gatherings. A woman who fainted at dinner was often congratulated for having a delicate digestion, which is a polite way of saying she hasn't eaten since Tuesday. By the late Victorian era, the craze persisted but slowly shifted as new medical theories emerged. Some doctors encouraged more balanced meals, warning that extreme dieting weakened the constitution. But the cultural pressure remained. Thinness stayed fashionable, vinegar tonic stayed popular, and the fear of fat endured as a silent, invisible force shaping Victorian daily life. Looking back, Victorian dieting reveals a society tangled in contradictions, obsessed with food yet terrified of eating it, desperate for health yet misinformed about how to achieve it, and always ready to trust a trend if it came with a famous poet's endorsement. Their weight loss culture wasn't merely scientific, it was emotional, moral, and theatrical, a perfect reflection of the era itself. When you picture a Victorian gym, don't imagine modern treadmills, padded mats, or helpful posters reminding you to listen to your body. No. Imagine a room full of wooden contraptions built by someone who clearly misunderstood both physics and human anatomy. A handful of iron weights shaped like artillery shells, and a group of people attempting calisthenics in outfits that could double as small tents. Now add corsets. Corsets everywhere. Victorian gym culture was a chaotic blend of enthusiasm, bad engineering, and a cheerful disregard for human safety. Imagine doing squats while wearing a ribcage on backwards. Victorian fitness culture was born out of a simple fear, the fear that industrialization, trains, factories, elevators, and the horrifying concept of sitting would turn the population soft. Writers lamented the decline of manly vigour and feminine robustness, phrasing that made it sound as though the population were wilting like unwatered houseplants. In response, gymnasiums began springing up in schools, private clubs, public bathhouses, and even some homes. The idea was noble, the execution interesting. For starters, Victorian exercise machines didn't look like machines so much as medieval torture devices someone had repurposed for fitness. Designers loved pulleys, ropes, gears, and massive wooden beams. They created rowing machines that jerked unpredictably, leg press devices capable of trapping skirts like hungry beasts, and reformer benches whose springs sometimes snapped with the enthusiasm of an overexcited bear trap. Manuals proudly advertised these machines as invigorating and fortifying, though the real workout often involved simply trying not to get hit in the face. One popular device, the health lift, was essentially a stack of weights on a platform you lifted by pulling a handle attached to a chain. The theory was sound, the accidents were legendary. If the chain slipped, the weights dropped with a thunderous crash, occasionally taking the user's dignity or consciousness with them. Other machines required a partner to operate, which often meant trusting your friend, sibling, or spouse not to pull the wrong lever and accidentally catapult you across the room. Calisthenics weren't safer. Victorian manuals instructed users to engage in activities like jumping lightly but firmly, swinging from wall-mounted poles, and bending crisply at the waist, all while wearing clothing that did not allow crisp bending of any kind. Men exercised in wool trousers, stiff shirts, and heeled boots. Women exercised in long skirts and tightly laced corsets, the latter ensuring that deep breathing remained more aspirational than achievable. Yes, women were encouraged to do gymnastics in corsets. And picture a woman attempting a forward bend while her organs are neatly arranged like luggage in an overhead compartment. Picture her trying to climb a rope ladder, only to discover that her skirt is wrapped around the rungs like a determined python. Picture her attempting a simple stretch and hearing her corset stays creak ominously, as if whispering, "Try that again, and we both go down." Gymnastics demonstrations became popular public entertainment. Audiences watched in awe as men vaulted over wooden horses, swung on rings, or attempted handstands. The problem? Victorian gym floors weren't padded. They were wood, solid, unforgiving wood. If you fell off a balance beam or missed a vault, your landing sounded like someone dropping a sack of potatoes from the roof. Newspapers politely praised performers' bravery while discreetly omitting the lengthy list of injuries sustained. Then there were the dumbbells, which in Victorian times were anything but dumb. Many were made of cast iron, with smooth handles and spherical ends that rolled alarmingly when dropped. Weightlifting wasn't standardized yet, so weights varied dramatically. A dumbbell marked medium might weigh anywhere from 2 pounds to 20. Beginners learned this the hard way, often on their toes. Home exercise wasn't much safer. Since gym memberships were expensive, families relied on illustrated pamphlets showing workouts one could perform in the privacy of one's parlour. These instructions ranged from swinging the arms vigorously while pacing briskly, fine, to jumping over chairs to improve agility, less fine, to rapid spinning for optimal circulation, absolutely not fine. Someone in the Victorian era truly believed spinning in circles for 2 minutes straight should be part of a daily routine, a suggestion guaranteed to leave participants dizzy, confused, and possibly entangled in the nearest drapery. Children's fitness was a whole separate adventure. Inspired by military drills, schools introduced regimented exercises that involved marching, synchronized arm movements, and the occasional attempt at pyramid building. Boys often practiced with wooden rifles, learning martial fitness, while girls were assigned more delicate routines, though still in corsets, making even gentle stretching a minor act of heroism. Of course, the Victorians didn't consider any of this dangerous. To them, exertion, awkward falls, and mild concussions were simply signs of building fortitude. If someone sprained an ankle, that meant they hadn't been training hard enough. If a machine pinched, bruised, or launched its user sideways, that was evidence the device was effective. And if a corset snapped during calisthenics, which it occasionally did, or everyone politely pretended it was not a sign that the human body preferred flexibility to structural engineering. Despite the hazards, gym culture persisted, evolving into sports clubs, athletic societies, and organised competitions. Victorians genuinely believed they were forging stronger bodies and stronger characters, even if it meant risking occasional bodily harm along the way. And to their credit, they weren't entirely wrong. Many people did become fitter, more coordinated, and more confident. They just also collected a surprising number of bruises. By the end of the era, exercise clothing slowly became more practical, machines became safer, and medical professionals started issuing real warnings about overexertion and poor form. But Victorian gym culture left behind a legacy of earnest ambition, questionable design, and the eternal human belief that self-improvement is worth a little chaos. If ever there was a product that perfectly captured Victorian optimism, gullibility, an unshakable commitment to being swindled gracefully, it was snake oil. Imported from the United States with the same enthusiastic curiosity Victorians gave to new machinery, exotic teas, and travelling hypnotists, snake oil was marketed as the cure for everything except skepticism. It was the miracle tonic that promised relief, revitalisation, and rejuvenation, usually delivered by a salesman standing on a crate, waving a bottle that glinted in the sunlight like liquid hope. Snake oil's origins were genuinely promising. In parts of East Asia, oils derived from certain species of snakes did have anti-inflammatory properties, but when the idea made its way to America and then to Britain, capitalism worked its magic, Suddenly every salesman was bottling snake oil that contained anything except snakes. Alcohol? Absolutely. Turpentine? Often. Laxatives, flavourings, herbs, dyes, and occasionally something deadlier. Without question, the only thing rarely included was actual snake extract. But who needed snakes when you had confidence? Travelling salesmen were the heart of the operation. These were charismatic performers disguised as medical experts, armed with rehearsed speeches, portable stages, and enough charm to sell a sponge to a drowning man. They travelled from town to town in wagons painted with phrases like "wonders of modern science" or "cures you must see to believe," which should have been everyone's first warning. But Victorians adored a good spectacle. A salesman would arrive in a village square, set up a barrel or makeshift platform, and begin his pitch with theatrical flair. He'd pull a bottle from his coat, hold it high, and announce that this elixir could heal back pain, headaches, weak nerves, stomach troubles, melancholy, marital dissatisfaction, and female ailments, a phrase that covered such a wide variety of experiences it might as well have said anything. The crowd gathered, the children pointed, the adults leaned forward, breathing in the familiar mixture of horse manure and fresh deception. Then came the demonstrations. Ah yes, the performances that would shame even modern infomercials. A salesman might call on a volunteer claiming to have a stiff arm. After rubbing the miracle oil on the limb and instructing the volunteer to move it again, the person naturally found they could, because fear, adrenaline, and the desire not to embarrass themselves in public have astonishing effects. Sometimes the salesman travelled with an accomplice, someone planted in the crowd who would leap forward declaring breathlessly, "I haven't walked without pain in 10 years." It didn't matter if no one recognised them from the previous village show 6 days ago. The performance worked. People gasped. Several immediately reached for their purses. Then the bottles were sold at prices high enough to sting but low enough to make buyers feel clever. And once purchased, the product offered results. Not actual cure results, of course, but results like warmth from alcohol, numbness from camphor, dizziness from chloroform residues, or the sudden belief that life was improving simply because you spent good money and needed that to be true. Back in Victorian homes, snake oil joined a crowded shelf of dubious remedies. People rubbed it into aching joints, dabbed it onto temples, swallowed teaspoons before bed, or massaged it into cramped muscles. Some swore it worked miracles, others remained politely disappointed. But no matter how ineffective it was, the next time a salesman came to town, eager buyers still lined up. Hope was a commodity, and Victorians purchased it again and again with unwavering faith. The British upper classes found snake oil particularly amusing. They enjoyed the spectacle, the novelty, and the idea of American-style vigour packaged in a little bottle. Some kept it as a conversation piece. Others used it earnestly, because a remedy that promised to restore youthfulness fit perfectly into their eternal quest to age gracefully while hiding any solstice sign of weakness. Newspapers occasionally mocked the trend, gently of course, but their warnings rarely rivaled the salesman's persuasive energy. What made snake oil so irresistible wasn't merely the charisma of its sellers, it was the era itself. Victorians lived in a time of breakthroughs, and breakthroughs that should never have been. Telegraphs, anesthesia, photography, exploding hair creams. So when a bottle claimed to hold the next great advancement, people believed it. Why wouldn't they? Science was everywhere, glowing, humming, sparking, transforming life at dizzying speed. If electricity could cure nerves, and radium could make you glow, literally, then surely a bottle of oil could soothe every ache in your overworked body. Even as medical professionals began warning against these quack cures, many people trusted salesmen more than doctors. Doctors were expensive, sometimes grumpy, and occasionally murderous in their enthusiasm for extreme treatments. A friendly salesman promising relief in a pleasant voice felt infinitely more approachable. And unlike many physicians of the era, snake oil peddlers rarely prescribed bloodletting or mercury, so by comparison, they almost seemed sensible. Eventually, as regulations tightened and scientific understanding matured, snake oil's reputation crumbled. Journalists exposed fraudulent ingredients. Chemists analysed popular brands and revealed shocking contents. Courts dragged sellers into scandalous trials where they defended themselves with the dignified argument of whoops. But even as the industry dwindled, the legacy of snake oil lived on. In every miracle cure, every too good to be true product, and every infomercial boasting life-changing results for just 3 easy payments. Snake oil wasn't just a product, it was a performance. A cultural phenomenon, a travelling theatre of hope and spectacle. And for many Victorians, it delivered exactly what they really wanted. Not a cure, but the comforting illusion that one existed. If you ever wondered how Victorians coped with living in a world full of pollution, rigid etiquette, explosive health fads, unreliable doctors, and furniture with too many sharp corners, the answer is simple: laudanum. The opium-infused solution was the Swiss Army knife of Victorian medicine, always on hand, always recommended, and always stronger than anyone admitted. It was used for headaches, toothaches, heartbreaks, stomach aches, boredom, sleeplessness, loud children, inconvenient emotions, and any situation where collapse seemed appropriate. If life was exhausting, laudanum helped by making sure you weren't awake for any of it. Laudanum wasn't new, but Victorians raised its popularity to an art form. At its core, it was a mixture of opium and alcohol, a soothing, numbing, dream-producing potion that tasted like licorice and poor decisions. Apothecaries sold it everywhere, doctors recommended it liberally, and families kept bottles in cupboards the way modern households keep aspirin. If you opened a Victorian medicine cabinet, you'd find laudanum sitting proudly beside castor oil, smelling salts and the ghost of medical judgment. The genius of laudanum was that it worked, at least in the immediate sense. It dulled pain, calmed nerves, and made the world feel pleasantly blurred around the edges, like viewing life through a velvet curtain. For people dealing with constant aches, untreated injuries, miserable working conditions, or the emotional strain of being alive in the 1800s, that was a miracle. But it also came with the tiny drawback of being profoundly addictive. Victorian society, however, was far too busy sipping to care. Doctors prescribed laudanum with astonishing confidence. If you had a cold, you took laudanum. If you had a migraine, laudanum. If your stomach hurt, laudanum. If your stomach hurt because you had taken too much laudanum, astonishingly, the solution was still laudanum. Even infants were given soothing syrups that contained generous amounts of opium, which stopped babies from crying, by ensuring they slept so deeply the household worried only occasionally. Writers adored laudanum. Poets, novelists, and philosophers consumed it like inspiration in liquid form. Some claimed it helped calm their nerves or ignite creativity. Others used it because everything else in their lives was collapsing, and laudanum was the only thing that didn't argue back. Many literary works from the era were produced while the author was floating serenely through an opium haze, politely refusing reality's demands. But poets weren't the only enthusiasts. Housewives used laudanum to cope with the monotony and emotional pressures of domestic life. Men working physically punishing jobs used it to dull pain and keep going. Aristocrats used it because their social circles expected constant emotional restraint, and a little laudanum ensured the mask stayed firmly in her place. Even grandparents used it as a nightly ritual, a drop or two for sleep, a drop or two for nerves, a drop or two for general discomfort, which covered everything from indigestion to the existential despair Victorians suffered in alarming quantities. The drug blurred social lines. Rich and poor alike used it, though in different ways. Wealthy families bought elegantly labelled bottles from fashionable chemists. The poor purchased cheap versions, often harshly made, sometimes mixed with questionable ingredients, occasionally lethal. But laudanum's appeal crossed every boundary. It was the equal opportunity escape hatch from a world that offered little softness. Naturally, the side effects were spectacular. Regular users experienced mood swings, nausea, dizziness, constipation. apathy, and an increasingly complicated relationship with consciousness. But Victorians, in their unshakable devotion to suffering, often interpreted these symptoms as evidence that the body was adjusting. To them, discomfort was simply part of life, or in some cases, the sign of a treatment purifying the system. You could be visibly deteriorating and still insist the medicine was helping. Addiction became widespread, though rarely acknowledged. People describe their dependency with gentle euphemisms: strong reliance, daily necessity, my evening comfort. Newspapers occasionally published warnings, but only when someone died dramatically. Even then, the assails tended to blame improper use, not the drug itself. After all, laudanum was considered respectable. It was tied to intellectualism, refinement, and good housekeeping. Calling it dangerous felt almost impolite. Victorian women, in particular, were quietly encouraged to rely on laudanum. Doctors diagnosed them with vague conditions like nervous exhaustion, hysteria, or melancholic tendencies, then handed them prescriptions soaked in opium. Society expected women to be calm, patient, and emotionally steady while enduring enormous pressure, a problem laudanum conveniently masked. It was the era's emotional anesthetic. Eventually, medical professionals began to recognize the dangers. Toward the late Victorian period, articles started questioning whether perhaps, maybe, possibly, giving an entire nation access to cheap opium might have health consequences. A few reformers called for regulations, doctors discussed limits. Chemists adjusted formulations to make them slightly less potent, though slightly is doing heavy lifting here. But by that point, laudanum had dug itself deeply into Victorian culture. Even as government restrictions increased, many people simply switched to other opium-based products or purchased laudanum quietly. Old habits die hard, especially habits that make the world feel pleasantly blurred. Laudanum eventually faded as newer medicines emerged, but its legacy endures as one of the most iconic and widely consumed substances of the 19th century. It soothed pain in a painful world. It dulled sorrow in an era full of it. It turned sleepless nights into drifting dreams. And it left behind a quiet reminder that even respectable societies sometimes solve their problems by numbing themselves into temporary oblivion. Long before modern wellness retreats offered cucumber water and quiet mindfulness sessions, Victorians flocked to hydropathy resorts, vast estates dedicated to water treatments that ranged from mildly uncomfortable to "my soul has left my body and is filing a complaint." Hydropathy promised rejuvenation, purity, and a complete reset of the mind and body through cold plunges, wet sheet wrappings, surprise hosing, and baths that felt like being punished for crimes you didn't commit. Basically a spa, if the spa wanted to fight you. Hydropathy, also called the water cure, began as an alternative medical movement that claimed almost any ailment: digestive troubles, headaches, anxiety, heartbreak, gout, weak nerves, or the general exhaustion of being a Victorian human, could be improved by immersing oneself in water. It didn't matter what the problem was. To hydropaths, the solution was always H2O, applied with enthusiasm and often unnecessary force. If you felt unwell, water would fix it. If you felt too well, water would fix that too. Hydropathy resorts quickly became fashionable, especially among the middle and upper classes. These sprawling facilities were often located in scenic countryside settings: rolling hills, fresh air, babbling streams, all carefully curated to distract guests from the fact that they were about to be soaked, wrapped, sprayed, or submerged in ways no one had fully agreed to. Visitors arrived with trunks full of clothes, letters of recommendation, and vague hopes of emerging as better, more balanced humans. What they got was a schedule that read like a storm survival manual. The first experience many guests faced was the wet sheet wrap, a hydropathic specialty that involved being tightly cocooned in layers of freezing wet linen before being buried under blankets. The theory was that the body would gradually warm the wet sheets, producing a healing reaction. The reality was lying motionless, shivering aggressively, while contemplating all life choices that led to this moment. Some guests found it calming, others prayed for escape. Staff considered both reactions normal. Then came the plunge baths, which were exactly what they sounded like. Deep tubs filled with water cold enough to make your ancestors gasp. Guests were instructed to enter quickly, no hesitation allowed, and remain inside for a medically recommended duration, usually however long the attendant felt like making them suffer. People screamed, flailed, and occasionally reconsidered the meaning of health, but the Victorians believed that the shock stimulated the system, which is a poetic way of saying it convinced the body it was under attack. Of course, no hydropathy resort would be complete without hose treatments, the most confrontational form of the water cure. An attendant, often a burly man with forearms like tree trunks, aimed a high-powered jet of cold water directly at the guest, turning the therapy session into something resembling riot control. Guests were told to rotate slowly so every part of the body could be equally blasted. Some described the experience as invigorating. Others described it as being personally targeted by Poseidon. Hydrotherapists insisted all of these treatments balanced the body, calmed the nerves, and realigned one's vital energies. They claimed water could cure insomnia, indigestion, melancholy, and even chronic pain, though they also warned that if it didn't work the first time, more water was needed. Patients often stayed for weeks, undergoing daily regimens that included cold foot baths, tepid sitz baths, alternating temperature showers, and drinking enormous quantities of spring water until they were on a first-name basis with the bathroom door. The atmosphere of these resorts was a curious blend of health retreat, boot camp, and polite social gathering. Guests attended lectures on personal wellness, strolled through manicured gardens, and mingled in lounges where everyone tried very hard to pretend they hadn't spent the morning screaming into a towel while being hosed like a misbehaving circus animal. Friendships were formed, romances blossomed, and rivalries developed among those who claimed to endure the cold water immersions longer. Despite the often punishing treatments, hydropathy became wildly popular. Why? Because Victorian daily life was stressful, chaotic, and often unhealthy. Industrial cities were crowded and polluted. Work was exhausting, meals were unpredictable. Stress relief wasn't a cultural priority. Hydropathy resorts promised an escape, a structured place where guests could rest, be cared for, and temporarily avoid the pressures of society. Even if the water therapy was questionable, the change of scenery was undeniably healing. Not all practitioners were gentle. Some hydropathic doctors insisted patients adhere to strict diets, which usually meant bland food, minimal portions, and absolutely no flavour. Others implemented intense routines that pushed guests to physical extremes. But many visitors still reported feeling better, whether due to the treatments, the environment, the fresh air, or the relief of not having to interact with their normal responsibilities for several weeks. Critics emerged, of course. Some doctors called hydropathy unscientific nonsense and mocked the idea that cold water could cure complex illnesses. Skeptics pointed out that many resort success stories involved patients who probably just needed rest, hydration, and fewer daily demands, all things the resorts accidentally provided while drenching them. But no amount of criticism stopped the trend. Hydropathy became a symbol of modern wellness, a sign that one valued health, discipline, and the transformative power of water arranged in increasingly dramatic ways. By the late Victorian era, hydropathy began blending into more traditional medicine. Some elements stuck around: cold plunges, contrast baths, hydrotherapy massages, though thankfully without the screaming hose assaults. Resorts modernized, treatments softened, and future generations inherited spa culture in a less aggressive form. But the original hydropathy resorts remain a testament to Victorian determination. The belief that healing required effort, discipline, and a willingness to be wrapped, dunked, blasted, chilled, or cocooned in linens until reborn. It wasn't relaxing, it wasn't gentle, and it definitely wasn't warm. But for Victorians seeking renewal, it was all water, and therefore it was everything. If there is anything the Victorians feared almost as much as illness, it was losing their hair. In an age obsessed with appearances, Sculpted waistlines, porcelain skin, vigorous posture. Hair was the crown atop the entire performance. Thick, glossy locks meant vitality, beauty, morality, and good breeding. Thinning hair, on the other hand, a sign that one's constitution was faltering, one's spirit was drooping, and one's social desirability was in catastrophic decline. So the Victorians did what the Victorians always did. They turned to elaborate, dangerous, and chemically questionable remedies. Nothing says luxury like hair that falls out in tidy Victorian handfuls. Hair loss anxiety didn't discriminate. Men dreaded receding hairlines as symbols of aging or diminished virility. Women feared thinning hair because it threatened the elaborate hairstyles that could take hours and several structural pins to assemble. And so an enormous market emerged, promising regrowth, rejuvenation, and renewed follicular vitality, a phrase that sounds scientific while meaning absolutely nothing. The shelves of apothecaries overflowed with hair potions, each more dramatic than the last. Some came in elegant glass bottles, marketed with flowery fonts and sweeping claims. Others arrived in plain jars with mysterious labels like revitalizing essence or grandmother's restorative, as if implying that Granny herself had personally approved the formula. She hadn't. Granny was busy soaking her feet in vinegar and fainting dramatically in parlours. But beneath the charming packaging lurked chemistry so reckless it would make a modern dermatologist scream. The star ingredient of Victorian hair remedies. Lead. Yes, lead. The same metal used in pipes, paint, and historically questionable cosmetics. Lead acetate, in particular, became a popular foundation for hair tonics. Advertisements described it as darkening, so restorative, and reviving to the scalp, while neglecting to mention that it was poisonous, unhealthy, and determined to ruin your day. Lead-based hair products worked, if your definition of worked included temporarily darkening hair while gradually poisoning the user. Over time, lead accumulated in the body, causing headaches, nausea, muscle weakness, and a distinctive skin pallor that probably cancelled out any aesthetic benefits of darker hair. Long-term use could and did cause neurological damage. But at the time, Victorians simply interpreted these symptoms as delicate nerves, poor circulation, or too much indoor reading. If lead wasn't your preferred method of follicular torment, don't worry. The Victorians had options. Another popular ingredient was ammonia, which chemists touted as a powerful stimulant for the scalp, and stimulate it did. Ammonia rubbed directly onto the skin could produce delightful sensations such as burning, tingling, redness, and the overwhelming desire to rethink every decision that led to this moment. The fumes alone were enough to make eyes water, yet many Victorians swore by it, believing a burning scalp was simply evidence of the medicine penetrating. In reality, it was evidence that their scalp was being chemically interrogated. Some tonics also contained perfumed oils mixed with ingredients like sulfur or alcohol. These formulas promised to awaken the follicles and soften the roots, phrases that sound encouraging until you realize sulfur smells like an offended volcano. Using these products meant walking around smelling faintly of brimstone and regret. Not ideal in a society already overwhelmed by coal smoke. Women in particular were bombarded with miracle oils, often imported from distant lands with exotic names and lofty claims. Egyptian hair invigorator, Himalayan root elixir, Arabian night growth serum. Most contained simple scented oils, some harmless, some mildly irritating, and a few containing ingredients one might expect to find in a cleaning cupboard rather than a beauty routine. But marketing convinced many that these foreign-sounding concoctions held ancient secrets, and in the Victorian imagination, ancient secrets always worked. To enhance these potions, Victorians often added hairbrush techniques that bordered on violent. Manuals encouraged vigorous brushing, up to 100 strokes a night, to stimulate growth. Combined with tonics, this often created the perfect storm: irritated skin, weak follicles, and accelerated shedding. Many users would find extra hair in their brushes and conclude that the treatment was extracting impurities, a deeply optimistic interpretation of reality. Men also experimented with hair growth devices, mechanical scalp massagers, vibrating brushes, and even helmet-like contraptions designed to strengthen circulation. None worked, unless one counts improving cardiovascular health by causing mild panic during use. Yet despite limited or negative results, the demand for hair growth potions only increased. Victorians wanted rapid solutions, and the more dramatic a remedy sounded, the more likely people were to trust it. If a tonic promised to revitalise the scalp, consumers ignored any strange smells. If it promised youthful locks restored, they tolerated burning sensations. If it promised renewed manliness, men applied it with the enthusiasm of a general launching an offensive. The side effects, when they arrived, were explained away with impressive creativity. Scalp irritation? Proof the tonic was working. Hair turning brittle? A sign of transition. Actual hair loss? Evidence that new growth would soon emerge. Spoiler, it didn't. By the late Victorian era, as scientific understanding improved, doctors began warning against many hair growth potions. Newspapers exposed fraudulent recipes. Regulatory pressure increased. And slowly the most dangerous formulas disappeared, though some were quietly rebranded with fewer claims and slightly less poison. But the legacy of Victorian hair remedies lingers. Every modern miracle shampoo, every sim with questionable claims, every ad promising thicker, fuller, more radiant hair, they all echo a tradition that began when Victorians gazed into mirrors, feared what they saw, and reached for a bottle that promised to fix everything. Victorian hair growth potions didn't just damage hair, they revealed the era's anxious heart. A world terrified of aging, desperate for control, and ready to believe that the perfect head of hair was just one more questionable ingredient away. If you've ever complained about modern dental visits, the suction tube, the fluorescent lights, the gentle existential dread, allow me to introduce you to the Victorian dentist, a man whose toolkit resembled something you'd use to repair a barn roof. In the 19th century, dentistry wasn't the refined, mildly terrifying profession it is today. It was a full-contact sport, performed with unsterilised tools, questionable theories, and no anaesthesia whatsoever. Your dentist didn't numb pain, he just yelled, "Brace yourself!" Let's start with everyday oral hygiene, a subject Victorians approached with the same enthusiasm they had for bathing, intermittently, cautiously, and with ingredients that would make a modern dentist burst into flames. The earliest Victorian toothpastes weren't pastes at all. They were tooth powders, sold in tins, paper packets, or charming containers that hid their true identities as mouth-destroying grenades. The star ingredient? Abrasives. The sharper, the grittier, the more determined they were to strip your enamel right off your teeth. Common tooth powder ingredients included crushed seashells, ground charcoal brick dust, powdered pumice, chalk, baking soda mixed with mysterious flavourings. Brick dust, yes, literal pulverised brick, was especially popular because it made teeth look whiter by sanding them into a smoother shape. If you were lucky, you only lost a layer of enamel. If unlucky, you gained a permanent sensitivity to weather changes. Many powders also included borax, believed to cleanse and whiten, which it did, at the cost of making your gums feel like they were dissolving. Some powders even contained acid because nothing says healthy smile like encouraging your teeth to erode faster. Victorians sometimes rubbed their teeth with cloth soaked in vinegar or lemon juice, believing the acidity would bleach stains. Technically true, but it also bleached away structural integrity. Combine daily acid rubs with a nice brushing of brick dust and you basically created the mid-century version of dental Russian roulette. Of course, many Victorians didn't brush at all. The wealthier classes might own toothbrushes, usually made with bone handles and bristles plucked from unlucky animals, but most households considered them optional. Some people shared toothbrushes among family members, an idea so horrifying it deserves its own Dickens novel. Others simply avoided brushing, relying on mints, herbs, or good old-fashioned denial. And then there were the homemade remedies, the crown jewels of Victorian ingenuity. These included rubbing teeth with soot for whitening, polishing with table salt for shine, scrubbing with bread crusts for texture, gargling with brandy for courage, but bad toothpaste was nothing compared to bad dentistry. Dentists, or more accurately, anyone who claimed to be a dentist, varied wildly in skill. Some were trained, many were not. Some were barbers moonlighting as tooth pullers. Others were travelling dental experts who roamed towns offering extractions in pubs, fairs and open markets. You knew you'd found the right place if you saw a crowd gathered around a man holding pliers and grinning like he wasn't about to cause catastrophic trauma. Tooth extraction was the cure for everything. Tooth pain, gum pain, jaw pain, ear pain, headache, spiritual crisis. If you had a problem, out came the tooth. One yank, or several yanks, depending on the tooth's commitment to staying inside your skull, and the problem was solved. Possibly, hopefully, sometimes. There were no numbing agents, no anesthesia, no gentle encouragement. The dentist simply gripped the tooth, braced his foot against the patient's chest, yes, really, and pulled like he was starting a reluctant lawnmower. Successful extractions were announced triumphantly. Unsuccessful ones involved screaming, blood, and occasionally fainting. But since fainting was practically a Victorian hobby, no one blamed them. Fillings did exist, but they were primitive. Early fillings used materials like lead, tin, copper. Amalgams mixed with questionable metals, lead once again was considered stylish. Dental journals praised its malleability, while conveniently ignoring its slowly poisoning your bloodstream tendencies. Root canals were rare and often worse than losing the tooth. Drilling tools were hand-cranked, producing noise, heat, and psychological damage. Patients endured the full sensation of nerves being scraped, burned, or prodded, experiences that likely increased religious devotion by 200%. False teeth offered their own nightmares. Some were carved from animal bone or ivory, which stained quickly and smelled terrible. Others were made of porcelain, which looked beautiful but could shatter mid-meal, turning dinner into an unexpected dental emergency. Wealthy individuals sometimes purchased dentures made from human teeth, sourced either from grave robbers or from the living poor, who sold teeth for cash with varying degrees of regret. Yet despite all this, Victorians prided themselves on their smiles. Advertisements promised pearly white teeth and breath sweet as a meadow breeze, claims presented alongside products that chemically assaulted the mouth. Dentists insisted that discomfort built character. Health manuals lectured that neglecting teeth invited moral decay. And the public, ever obedient, carried on brushing with substances better suited for resurfacing a brick wall. By the end of the Victorian era, dental science finally began improving. Enamel-friendly materials emerged. Anesthetics became available. Trained dentists replaced wandering showmen. Toothpaste matured into something recognizable. But the memory of Victorian dentistry remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that whitening should never involve masonry materials. If you think modern wellness trends get a little weird, just wait until you step into the smoke-filled haze of Victorian medicine, a world where tobacco wasn't just a pastime, but a prescription. Doctors recommended smoking for lung problems, encouraged parents to give tobacco to children, and even pumped smoke into places smoke should absolutely never go. Victorians treated lungs the way modern people treat printers, with abuse and wishful thinking, to understand how this smoky chaos began. We must remember one crucial Victorian trait. If something felt stimulating, invigorating, or vaguely dramatic, they assumed it was medicinal. Tobacco delivered all three. A puff made you feel alert. A pipe made you feel sophisticated. A cigar made you feel like you'd achieved something important. And so, late 18th and 9th century doctors proclaimed tobacco a healing herb, a gift from nature that soothed nerves, cleared minds, sharpened spirits, and banished melancholy. Conveniently ignored. the fact that the human lung was not designed to inhale bonfire fumes on purpose. Tobacco's most infamous medical use? Asthma cigarettes. Yes, cigarettes designed specifically for people who had trouble breathing. These were marketed as herbal asthma cigarettes, often containing stramonium, belladonna, or other ingredients whose safety records ranged from unproven to absolutely not. The logic was simple. Smoke relaxes the muscles, therefore smoking relaxes the airway muscles. The problem, of course, was that smoke also irritates literally everything it touches. Asthma sufferers wheezed, the cigarettes crackled, the room filled with a smoky fog thick enough to summon ghosts, and Victorian doctors, standing proudly beside their patients, announced triumphantly, "See? Improvement." Whether the patient actually improved or simply decided not to argue while choking was never fully clarified. But asthma cigarettes were only the polite beginning of tobacco as medicine. Things got far stranger. For stomach troubles, some physicians recommended tobacco in small but potent doses to stimulate the digestive organs. Translated into modern terms, that meant chew on this plant that induces nausea, then lie down and hope you don't regret everything. Unsurprisingly, many patients vomited. Victorians chalked that up as a success, because if a treatment made you suffer, it must be purging impurities, a medical rule written nowhere but obeyed everywhere. For earaches, doctors sometimes instructed patients to blow tobacco smoke into each other's ears. No one questioned this. No one asked how ear tubes worked. No one even suggested gently warming a cloth instead. Instead, Victorian families crouched on carpets performing ear-to-mouth smoke transfers like some kind of improvised household steam ceremony. But nothing, truly nothing, compares to the tobacco method used to revive drowning victims, the tobacco smoke enema. Yes, smoke, delivered by enema, into the body, on purpose. The tobacco resuscitator, as it was called, was a widely available device consisting of a bellows, a tube, and enough misguided confidence to fill the River Thames. When someone collapsed from near drowning, shock, or sudden unconsciousness, rescuers were advised to insert the tube into the victim and pump warm tobacco smoke directly into the rectum. The idea was that the warmth and stimulation would awaken the body's internal functions. Imagine the scene: a frantic rescue, villagers surrounding a motionless victim, someone yelling, "Quick, get the tobacco," and another person sprinting over with a bellows and the enthusiasm of a man who definitely skipped a few chapters in the medical training manual. For years, this was considered cutting-edge life-saving technique. Doctors wrote about it. Medical journals endorsed it. Resuscitation kits stored along riverbanks came equipped with smoke enema devices. Children were warned about water safety not because drowning was dangerous, but because they feared what awaited them if they were rescued. Eventually, scientists discovered that nicotine delivered rectally could be fatal. But until then, the Victorians pumped smoke into patients with all the optimism of a society that still hadn't fully accepted germs. And let's not forget tobacco for children. Victorian parenting advice was full of opinions, most of them terrible. Some doctors recommended giving boys small amounts of tobacco to toughen their constitution. Others suggested that hyperactive children might benefit from tobacco's calming properties, which is a polite way of saying exhaust the child with a stimulant until he no longer has the will to misbehave. Teething infants sometimes receive tobacco rubs on their gums, a practice that seems only slightly less horrifying when you remember the era also used opium syrups for babies. Meanwhile, adults smoked constantly, so not recreationally, but medicinally. Pipes for nerves, cigars for digestion, cigarettes for asthma. Smoking rooms, popular in better homes, were not seen as indulgent retreats, but as health spaces where one could inhale enough second-hand smoke to qualify as an honorary chimney. And society embraced it. Advertisements praised tobacco's vital essence. Doctors endorsed it with complete confidence. Patients thanked their physicians for recommending something that was, for once, pleasant. Newspapers published glowing testimonials. I smoked one of Dr. X's asthma rolls and felt instantly relieved. followed by the unspoken truth, because the alternative was another Victorian cure that hurt more. As the century progressed, cracks began to appear. A few early researchers quietly pointed out that inhaling burning plant matter was not ideal. Reports surfaced of tobacco causing dizziness, heart palpitations, chronic cough, and irritation of the throat. Some people developed persistent breathing problems, which doctors ironically treated with even more tobacco. But the belief in tobacco as medicine remained strong well into the late 19th century, fueled by habit, culture, and the undeniable Victorian conviction that if something stung, smoked, or shocked the body, it must be good. Looking back, tobacco as medicine wasn't just a misfire. It was a perfect representation of Victorian health philosophy. Dramatic treatments, little evidence, and ironclad confidence wrapped neatly in smoke. There are many things Victorians loved with wild, unblinking enthusiasm. Formality, fainting, questionable medical gadgets, and anything that looked scientific, even if it smoked ominously. But above all, they adored health tourism. The idea that the right landscape, the right air, or the right smelly puddle could cure every problem from indigestion to existential dread. Victorian doctors prescribed vacations like Oprah. You get a spa day. Your dying aunt gets a spa day. This era produced a dazzling array of health destinations, each claiming miraculous effects. And the best part, these weren't merely vacations disguised as treatments. No, Victorians approached them with the seriousness of monks travelling to holy shrines. Let us begin with the great Victorian obsession, mineral spas. Spas had existed for centuries, but Victorians elevated them into national institutions of wellness. Towns like Bath, Buxton, Harrogate and Cheltenham boomed as pilgrims seeking health, or at least a break from London's air, which tasted like soot and disappointment, arrived in droves. The superstar attractions were mineral-rich waters that Victorians swore could cure gout, rheumatism, nervous disorders, female complaints, liver sluggishness, or any other condition politely discussed in mixed company. But these waters came with a catch. They often smelled like rotten eggs. Sulphur springs were especially famous, their pungent aroma drifting across entire towns. Visitors didn't just tolerate the smell, they embraced it. Doctors assured patients that the more aggressively the water assaulted their senses, the more effective it was. People drank it, bathed in it, inhaled its vapours, and soaked towels in it to drape across their foreheads like mildly suffering martyrs. Those who gagged politely insisted that you get used to it, which was Victorian code for pretend it doesn't smell like a swamp was set on fire. Spas offered luxurious bathing halls where attendants in crisp uniforms ushered guests into ornate tubs. Some treatments involved douche baths, where water was sprayed onto the body with varying pressure. A cousin to hydropathy's violent hoses, but with better marketing. Others involved vapour rooms, needle showers, or communal pools where strangers floated together in warm, mineral-rich clouds of steam, each privately hoping they wouldn't become conversational. Then came drinking rituals, where guests lined up like students at an unusually dramatic cafeteria, holding delicate glasses and grimacing politely as they swallowed mineral water, with the enthusiasm of someone biting a lemon, dipped in guilt. Many spas even hired musicians to play soft melodies, as though gentle violin strains could convince the stomach to accept its fate. But mineral spas were only the beginning. The Victorian health craze soon expanded to include mountain air retreats, a cure rooted in the belief that elevation cleansed the lungs and purified the soul. Switzerland, the Alps, and the Scottish Highlands became magnets for wealthy sufferers whose doctors proclaimed, "Go breathe air." And so they went. Mountain resorts offered long walks along picturesque trails, supervised breathing sessions, and rest cures, which mostly involved lying on lounge chairs while wrapped in blankets like hopeful baked potatoes. The crisp, thin air was believed to strengthen weak lungs and invigorate sluggish blood. Some patients spent months living in chalets, watching sunsets and writing letters home about how much better they felt. Because honestly, anyone would feel better after escaping the fog, smoke and noise and social anxiety of Victorian cities. But while mountain retreats offered serenity, seaside resorts offered spectacle. Victorians became obsessed with sea being, a supposedly therapeutic practice that required plunging oneself into frigid waves while wearing full bathing costumes, garments made of wool weighing roughly the same as a medium-sized sheep. Bathing machines, little wooden huts on wheels, carried bathers into deep water so they could slip out unseen. Once submerged, the bather flailed heroically in cold water, hoping the shock counted as invigorating. Doctors insisted seawater strengthened circulation, improved skin tone and cured melancholia, though it mostly cured any desire to go swimming again. Some seaside towns promoted their sea air as curative, which led to a curious phenomenon. Victorian tourists sitting motionless in chairs, facing the ocean, wrapped in blankets, letting salty wind slap them in the face while insisting they felt wonderful. Families strolled along piers, inhaled dramatic lungfuls of briny air, and patted themselves on the back for engaging in focused respiratory health improvement. But the greatest, strangest tourist trap came with the invention of respiratory caves, underground tunnels or grottos where the temperature and humidity were believed to cure asthma and chronic coughs. Patients wandered into dim, cool caverns and sat on benches in the dark, breathing the earth's damp exhalations and praying the dripping ceiling wouldn't land on them. Resort guides assured them that the underground ambience strengthened the lungs. Whether or not it worked, the novelty made people feel special, and Victorians adored anything that made them feel special. Of course, not every health tourism trip delivered miraculous transformation. Some guests became ill from the unfamiliar climate. Others suffered digestive disasters from mineral water that tasted like blended thunderclouds. A few arrived with mild conditions and left with stronger ones. But in typical Victorian fashion, these setbacks were blamed on the patient, not the treatment. Your nerves were clearly too sensitive, or you must repeat the spa regimen for 6 more months. Yet despite the questionable science, the appeal was undeniable. Health tourism offered Victorians something precious: rest. For industrial workers, exhausted mothers, frail intellectuals, anxious aristocrats, and anyone trapped in the rigid demands of the century, these retreats were a sanctioned escape, a socially acceptable vacation wrapped in the respectable language of medicine. By the end of the era, travel networks expanded, and health tourism evolved into mainstream leisure culture. Spas became resorts, coastal towns became holiday destinations, mountain retreats became summer homes for the wealthy, and the idea that travel cures everything lingered long after the sulphur fumes faded. Victorian health tourism was equal parts science, scenery and spectacle. It offered hope, novelty and a chance to breathe clean air in a century that desperately needed it, even if the cures were occasionally more theatrical than therapeutic. Of all the Victorian health trends, and there were many, each more questionable than the last, few captured the public imagination quite like homeopathy. It was elegant, it was gentle, it was scientific-looking without the burden of being scientifically correct. And most importantly, it let Victorians feel like they were taking medicine without actually taking anything. Homeopathy operated on tiny pills, enormous claims and unwavering confidence. Victorians basically paid for vibes. To understand why homeopathy swept through polite society, imagine living in an era where mainstream medicine involved bloodletting, mercury purges, and freezing baths that made your ancestors wince. Homeopathy arrived like a polite guest at a very chaotic dinner party. While other treatments screamed, stung, bled, bruised or purged, homeopathy whispered, "Here, take this perfectly harmless sugar pellet and believe." It felt civilized, it felt modern, and best of all, it felt painless, a rarity in Victorian healthcare. The movement began with the German physician Samuel Hahnemann, who proposed 2 main ideas that Victorians adopted with breathtaking enthusiasm. First principle, like cures like. This meant that if a substance could cause a symptom in a healthy person, it could cure that same symptom in someone sick. For example, a plant that made your eyes water could supposedly cure watery eyes. Something that triggered nausea could cure nausea. Something that caused insomnia could fix insomnia. Victorian logic adored this. It sounded deep, philosophical, almost poetic, like nature healing itself with its own mischievous tricks. Never mind that the principle was more metaphor than mechanism. Victorians loved metaphors. They also loved any medical idea that didn't involve bodily fluids leaving the body at high speed. Second principle, extreme dilution. And here's where the fun begins. Homeopathic medicines were created by diluting substances again and again, sometimes to the point where not a single molecule of the original ingredient remained. The water was then shaken vigorously, a process called succussion, believed to awaken the treatment's healing energy. The result? Bottles of water that supposedly remembered what had once touched them. Homeopaths called it potentization. Skeptical Victorians called it, well, nothing. There weren't many skeptical Victorians. Tiny sugar pills soaked in these ultra-diluted solutions became enormously popular. They were easy to take, tasted pleasant, and came in adorable little vials that made patients feel both important and cared for. Unlike the violent treatments of conventional medicine, homeopathic remedies did not make people faint, vomit, convulse, scream, or curse the name of their doctor. All significant improvements by Victorian standards. Victorian homeopaths claimed their remedies could cure a dizzying list of ailments. Fevers, indigestion, nervous tension, melancholy, palpitations, grief, sore throats, headaches, fatigue, nightmares, rheumatism, heartbreak, and anything else that threatened to dampen one's Victorian spirit. If you could name it, homeopathy had a tiny pill for it. Were the cures real? Sometimes. In the same way that sitting quietly, drinking water, and being hopeful can sometimes make you feel better. Many people improved not because the remedies contained active ingredients, but because they avoided the harsher treatments that might have actually made them worse. When the alternative was being bled, purged, or dunked into icy water, the placebo effect began to look like a miracle. The upper classes adored homeopathy. It was fashionable, refined, and aligned perfectly with Victorian values, gentle, orderly, and wrapped in philosophical language that could be discussed over tea. Wealthy families hired homeopathic doctors to attend to their children, especially after the public realised that laudanum, mercury, and near-drowning therapy might not have been the best choices for delicate youngsters. Middle-class mothers loved homeopathy because it offered them a sense of control. No more relying on unpredictable doctors with alarming tools. Homeopathy let them treat family illnesses privately, with kits that resembled jewellery boxes filled with tiny bottles of hope. Manuals instructed them on which remedies to use for which symptoms, and many women took pride in mastering the terminology. Being a homeopathic mother wasn't just medical, it was a status symbol. Even Queen Victoria herself was rumoured to favour homeopathy, and once royalty showed interest in something, the rest of Britain followed, with the enthusiasm of a marching band. Of course, not everyone approved. Some traditional doctors dismissed homeopathy as nonsense, calling it imagination medicine. Others accused homeopaths of exploiting the public's desperation for gentler cures. But many physicians secretly envied their homeopathic counterparts, whose patients rarely shrieked, fainted, or swore loudly during appointments. Meanwhile, homeopaths argued that the success of their treatments proved everything, conveniently sidestepping the fact that avoiding mercury and bloodletting had its own benefits. Homeopathic hospitals sprang up across Britain, offering serene environments and gentle care. Patients rested, ate well, avoided harsh treatments, and received attentive monitoring. It turns out that simply caring for people dramatically improves their health. Who knew? Victorian physicians did not, apparently. Still, the cracks eventually showed. As medical science advanced, germ theory expanded, and actual effective treatments emerged, homeopathy began to look like cures like, maybe poetic but biologically doubtful, infinite dilution, Hard to defend when chemists pointed out that memory water was not an accepted scientific concept, and yet homeopathy persisted, partly because its remedies didn't hurt anyone, and partly because humans have always been drawn to simple solutions wrapped in comforting rituals. By the end of the Victorian era, homeopathy had settled into a unique place in society. It wasn't fully mainstream, but it wasn't fringe either. It was an option, a gentle, sugar-coated alternative to the more dramatic choices the century had to offer. And even today, its cultural descendants carry on. Tiny pills, soothing language, sleek packaging, and big promises. Victorian homeopathy didn't just treat illness. It treated anxiety. It treated fear. It treated the Victorian desire to feel in control of a chaotic world. And if you don't look too closely at the scientific details, the whole thing almost makes sense. If you have ever been told to relax your mind or focus on your energy, congratulations, you've just grazed the surface of one of the Victorians' favourite medical spectacles, mesmerism. Long before wellness influencers waved crystals over houseplants, Victorians gathered in darkened parlours to watch a man in a dramatic coat wave his hands over a swooning patient while discussing magnetic fluids. Victorians essentially invented Reiki, but with more Mesmerism began a century earlier with Franz Anton Mesmer, an Austrian physician who believed the human body was filled with invisible magnetic forces. When these forces were balanced, health followed. When they were out of alignment, illness struck. Mesmer claimed he could manipulate these energies using hand movements, eye contact, and a general air of confidence that bordered on supernatural customer service. His ideas gained traction across Europe, especially among those who preferred mysterious cures over ones involving knives or mercury. By the Victorian era, mesmerism had become a full-blown cultural phenomenon. It blended science, performance, psychology, spectacle, and romance novels, sometimes all at once. Mesmerists travelled the country holding public demonstrations in lecture halls, mansions, and even taverns. Imagine a large room filled with people whispering excitedly, lights lowered, anticipation high. At the front stood the mesmerist, dressed impeccably, radiating gravitas and subtle theatre kid energy. The performance began with slow, deliberate gestures, the mesmerist waving his hands over the volunteer's head, tracing invisible patterns in the air, occasionally touching the temples or fixing the patient with an intense, lingering gaze. Audiences gasped. Women clutched fans. Men leaned forward with the seriousness of people observing a sacred ritual. And before long, the patient, often pre-selected, often susceptible to suggestion, occasionally just dramatically inclined, began to sway, stiffen, breathe deeply, or collapse into a trance. Victorians believed these trances opened a portal to healing. In a mesmerized state, patients reported feeling lighter, calmer, soothed or suspended in a delicious dreamlike haze. Some said they could no longer feel pain. Others claimed they saw visions or heard distant voices. A few became eerily compliant, following the suggestions without hesitation. Mesmerists took all of this as the proof of their ability to manipulate animal magnetism, which sounds like something you'd buy at a Victorian pet shop but was instead at the star of every mesmerist sales pitch. Mesmerism wasn't only used for entertainment. It quickly seeped into medicine, where it found a particularly enthusiastic audience among Victorian doctors searching for gentler alternatives to bloodletting, purging, and the other horrors their colleagues inflicted with alarming confidence. Doctors used mesmerism to treat insomnia, ease anxiety, reduce pain during dental procedures, calm nervous disorders, address melancholy of the spirit, and of course cure the infamous diagnosis of female hysteria. Victorian hysteria was the medical catch-all for any behaviour men didn't understand: irritability, sadness, ambition, boredom, passion, opinions, or simply being alive long enough to become frustrated by rigid Victorian gender rules. Hypnotic healing became the fashionable cure. Women were ushered into quiet rooms, placed in comfortable chairs, and mesmerized until they fell into peaceful trances that temporarily smoothed over the emotional chaos that society had no intention of actually fixing. Some physicians believed mesmerism helped women access their inner calm, though what it really provided was a socially acceptable way to take a break from constant responsibilities and expectations. But the doctors, delighted with themselves, declared success. If a patient left the trance feeling less irritated, they concluded mesmerism worked. If she left still irritated, they concluded she needed more mesmerism, a win-win for everyone, except the patient. Men also sought mesmerists, especially those suffering from stress-related ailments like overwork, nervous agitation, or the pressures of commerce. A hypnotic session offered relief in a century that never heard of work-life balance. Some men even hired private mesmerists to come to their homes, a luxury that made them feel important, progressive, and slightly magical. Mesmerism also gave birth to the phenomenon of trance healers, individuals who claimed they could diagnose illnesses while in hypnotic states. Patients sat quietly while healers, eyes closed, voices soft, described disturbances in the patient's invisible magnetic energies. These diagnoses were rarely medically accurate, but the poetic phrasing made them sound profound. People left feeling seen, soothed, and only occasionally confused. Despite its popularity, mesmerism sparked fierce debate. Some scientists denounced it as fraudulent performance. Others argued it revealed untapped psychological powers. Newspapers alternated between praising mesmerists as geniuses and mocking them as con artists with dramatic wardrobes. Clergy members expressed alarm, worrying that trances resembled possession. And skeptics frowned upon the idea of magnetic fluids, which had approximately the same scientific foundation as a bedtime story. Yet mesmerism thrived because it offered something the Victorians desperately needed: relief without violence. No blood, no pain, no freezing baths, no mercury, no screaming. Just soothing voices, quiet rooms, soft hand motions, and permission to relax, an experience so rare in the era that people mistook it for supernatural healing. By the late Victorian period, mesmerism evolved into what we now call hypnosis, shedding some of its mystical claims but retaining the calming trances. Scientists studied it through a more psychological lens, while performers continued using it for dramatic stage shows. The flamboyant magnetic fluid language faded, but the core practice endured. Mesmerism may not have realigned invisible energies or cured complex diseases, but it did accomplish something genuinely valuable. It taught Victorians the power of suggestion, the importance of rest, and the profound effect of simply being allowed to lie down for once. In a world of harsh treatments and relentless pressure, that alone felt like a miracle. If you ever feel embarrassed about falling for a modern personality quiz or clicking on an article titled "What Your Favourite Biscuit Reveals About You," take comfort. At least you didn't let a stranger run their hands over your head and diagnose your moral character based on bumps. The Victorians did, enthusiastically, regularly, with full confidence. Victorian logic: your skull says you're unwell. Phrenology, the 19th century pseudoscience of interpreting personality, morality, intelligence, and even physical health by examining the shape of the skull, was one of the century's most popular and unintentionally comedic trends. It merged sciencey vocabulary with theatrical flair, offering Victorians something irresistible, a way to understand themselves without confronting their actual emotions. The idea was simple, too simple, suspiciously simple. Phrenologists believed the brain consisted of dozens of organs, each responsible for a specific trait: courage, kindness, nous, destructiveness, curiosity, vanity, musical talent, moral sense, thriftiness, and so on. These organs, they claimed, grew or shrank depending on how often a trait was used, just like muscles. When one brain organ got bigger, it pushed outward and created a bump on the skull. By reading these bumps, a trained phrenologist could supposedly see your entire inner life mapped on your head like a badly drawn topographical chart. All of this sounded logical to Victorians, who adored categorising the human experience into neat boxes. They measured everything: skulls, footsteps, facial angles, pulse rhythms, the amount of soup an upper-class woman could consume without blushing. If something could be quantified, the Victorians would quantify it, even if it involved running their fingers across a stranger's scalp for 20 minutes. Phrenology sessions became social events. People flocked to parlours where professional readers conducted examinations with sombre seriousness. The phrenologist began by gently cradling the subject's head, as though holding a large fruit that might bruise under pressure. Then came the slow, deliberate tracing of bumps, ridges and curves, accompanied by murmurs such as, "Ah yes, a pronounced firmness organ. A shallow benevolence region." Here we see the beginning of cautiousness. Victorians treated these pronouncements as gospel. If the phrenologist said you were empathetic, you were empathetic. If he claimed you lacked self-control, you suddenly remembered that one time you ate 2 desserts in a week. And if he declared you naturally virtuous, well, that made your day, possibly your entire year. Phrenology wasn't simply about personality. It also claimed to diagnose health. A weak vitality organ meant you were prone to fatigue. A shallow combativeness region supposedly explained chronic fragility. A large destructiveness zone? Well, that caused great concern, especially from mothers who feared their children might grow up to join a travelling circus or ignore curfew. Some phrenologists insisted they could sense susceptibility to disease, especially mental illness, from skull shape alone. Others linked bumps to digestion problems, melancholy, overwork, or constitutional frailty, a diagnosis as vague as it was popular. And because the Victorians already connected health to morality, skull bumps soon served double duty, mapping not only physical wellness but also virtue. Imagine being told your headache came from weak hopefulness, or that your sore throat was caused by insufficient conscientiousness. Victorians accepted this without blinking. As phrenology grew, it slithered into every aspect of society. Employers used skull readings to judge the character of prospective workers. Parents had their children examined to determine whether they were destined for greatness or mediocrity. Young couples sought phrenological compatibility assessments, hoping bumps confirmed long-term romantic potential, a practice that must have led to some wildly uncomfortable dates. Schools incorporated phrenological principles into education, encouraging children to strengthen their intellectual organs by reading, practicing arithmetic, and reciting poetry with dramatic enthusiasm. Some parents even massaged their children's skulls in the belief that they could physically shape intelligence. If this sounds alarming, remember, this was the same era that thought corsets improved posture by compressing ribs into new shapes. Phrenology busts, plaster heads divided into labelled regions, became fashionable decorative items. Every respectable study featured one, sitting proudly on a shelf next to a magnifying glass and a copy of the Times. These busts served as both decor and conversation starters, allowing dinner guests to walk over, point dramatically at a labelled region and say things like, "Ah yes, ideality, very important for poets." But for all its popularity, phrenology had issues, massive issues. For one, the science wasn't science. No anatomical evidence supported the existence of neat, compartmentalized brain regions matching moral qualities. The skull does not reshape itself in adulthood. And bumps, usually caused by hats, hairpins, or the general hardships of Victorian life, not inner virtue. Critics emerged steadily. Some doctors mocked phrenology as polite fortune-telling. Others accused its practitioners of manipulating results to flatter clients. And while phrenology was mostly harmless, it also fueled harmful social theories, classism, racism, and the belief that entire groups could be evaluated based on cranial measurements. Still, the public clung to it for decades. Why? Because phrenology wasn't really about skulls. It was about certainty. It offered Victorians a comforting map of human nature, a way to explain behaviour without grappling with the messy complexities of psychology. It was soothing to believe personality came from bone structure rather than emotional reality. It was easier to accept shallow bumps than deep introspection. By the late Victorian era, as neuroscience advanced, phrenology faded quietly, dismissed by scientists but fondly remembered by the public as one of the great eccentric fascinations of the age. Today, it survives only in museums, antique shops, and the occasional decorative head sitting ironically on a modern bookshelf. Phrenology may have been wrong, spectacularly wrong, but it perfectly captured the Victorian spirit, curious, determined, eager to label everything, and perpetually confident that even the human soul could be understood with enough charts. If you have ever sat in a modern hospital waiting room and thought, "This place feels a bit stressful," allow me to offer a comforting reminder. At least you're not in a Victorian hospital, where the greatest medical threat wasn't always your illness. Sometimes it was the building, the doctors, the tools, the air, the walls, or the surgeon's coat washed last never. Victorian hospitals were places where hope went to be politely mugged by bacteria. To step into an early Victorian hospital was to enter a world where cleanliness was optional, bacteria were mythical, and infection was considered a personality flaw rather than a biological reality. The very idea of unseen germs causing disease was so controversial that physicians argued about it with the same heated intensity people now reserve for internet comment sections. Meanwhile, patients lay in crowded wards, breathing recycled misery and wondering if they should have simply stayed home and let fate do its thing. Let's begin with the surgical theatres, the beating, throbbing heart of Victorian medical drama. Picture a circular room, crowded with students perched on steep benches, eagerly leaning forward like spectators at an unusually violent opera. In the centre stood a patient, strapped to a table that looked more suitable for carpentry than surgery. The surgeon entered wearing his professional attire, a long, stiff canvas coat soaked with years of bodily fluids, streaks of dried blood, and stains so old they deserved their own archaeological dig. Surgeons actually took pride in these coats. The dirtier it was, the more experienced you appeared, which is a delightful philosophy, until you realise that coat is leaning over your open wound. The tools matched the vibe. Scalpels, bone saws, forceps, and clamps were wiped casually on aprons or sleeves between procedures. Not cleaned, not disinfected, just wiped. Instruments moved from one patient to the next, with the cheerful boldness of objects unaware they were carrying microscopic doom. If a surgeon dropped a tool, he simply picked it up, maybe blew on it, and continued. No one screamed contamination because contamination hadn't been invented yet. Operations were performed at lightning speed. Without anaesthesia for much of the early Victorian period, surgeons competed to see who could amputate a limb the fastest. The record, according to legend, was under 30 seconds. In this world, hesitation wasn't an option. Precision wasn't the goal. Survival was something of a bonus. Even after anaesthesia arrived, hygiene still didn't. Infection raged through hospitals with the enthusiasm of a gossip scandal. Post-surgical wards became grim gambling halls where patients and doctors quietly wondered, will the wound heal? Or will it turn colours no wound should ever turn? This phenomenon was called hospital fever, ward rot, or surgical miasma, depending on which doctor you asked. None realised the culprit was germs thriving on filthy hands, filthy beds, filthy tools, and airflow that could charitably be described as crime-adjacent. Speaking of hands, surgeons didn't wash them. Not before surgery, not after surgery, not between patients. Many proudly plunged their unwashed hands directly into wounds, believing the mere touch of an experienced doctor carried healing power. It did not. Hospitals themselves were labyrinths of hazard. Wards were packed tightly, with multiple patients sharing a single bed during high-demand epidemics. Windows were often kept closed to keep out bad air, which unfortunately locked in the much more dangerous air, full of floating bacteria and despair. Floors were sticky, linens rarely changed, and chamber pots overflowed because plumbing hadn't caught up with the century's ambitions. The smells were legendary, a choking blend of sweat, infection, dust, chemicals, and whatever occupied the buckets beneath patient beds. Visitors described hospitals as temples of suffering, which sounds poetic until you remember they meant it literally. Nurses, especially before formal training became widespread, did their best in conditions no human should endure. Some were overworked and undertrained, others were saints navigating chaos. Florence Nightingale's reforms, emphasising ventilation, cleanliness, organised wards and trained nursing, eventually transformed hospital care. But early in the era her ideas were considered radical. Clean sheets, fresh air, washing hands, what kind of revolutionary madness was that? And then there were maternity wards, which deserve their own horror novel. Childbirth at home was risky, childbirth in a Victorian hospital was often worse. Doctors moved between autopsies and labour rooms without washing hands, unintentionally transferring deadly infections to new mothers. Childbed fever killed thousands, women feared hospital births, and with good reason. Mortality rates were so high that giving birth near a medical school practically counted as recreational danger. Psychiatric hospitals too were places of deep suffering. Treatments ranged from misguided to cruel. Patients were locked in overcrowded rooms, subjected to ice baths, different from Hydropathy's spa-like versions, forced restraints or long periods of isolation. Conditions varied dramatically depending on funding and philosophy, but many institutions were bleak at best, dangerous at worst. Yet despite the horrors, Victorians trusted hospitals, or wanted to. The idea of centralised medical care was new, inspiring and deeply needed. People longed for treatment, even if the treatment came with risks, and slowly, painfully slowly, things improved. By the late Victorian era, pioneering physicians like Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic techniques, proving that carbolic acid, sterilised instruments and hand washing could drastically reduce infections. Hospital mortality dropped. Surgical success skyrocketed. Clean coats and clean hands became symbols of professionalism rather than weakness. The early Victorian hospital remains one of history's most sobering reminders. Medicine is powerful, but without knowledge, it becomes theatre, dramatic, earnest, and catastrophically hazardous. The men and women working in those early wards weren't villains. They were heroes operating without the script we take for granted today. They saved lives the only ways they knew, even as they unwittingly endangered others. But would you want surgery in a Victorian hospital? Absolutely not. Modern medicine may come with its own anxieties, but at least your surgeon's coat doesn't hold ancient DNA samples from a dozen former patients. Victorian parents loved their children truly, sincerely, but they also lived in an era where nearly every piece of childcare advice sounded like a dare issued by someone who had never met a baby. This was the age of soothing syrups laced with opium, teething powders spiked with mercury, rigid feeding schedules enforced with military precision, and child-rearing philosophies that viewed crying as a moral failing rather than communication. The Victorian childcare motto, "If the baby's quiet, don't ask why." Let's begin with the most infamous of all Victorian child health staples, soothing syrups. These miracle mixtures promised to calm fussiness, stop crying, ease teething pain, encourage sleep, and bring peace to the household. And they worked, and spectacularly, because they were basically bottles of narcotics wrapped in maternal reassurance. The most popular brands contained opium, morphine, alcohol, or all three. Some were marketed as nighttime syrups, others as nervous tonics, but the effect was always the same. The baby slept so deeply that parents could finally enjoy silence, and no one questioned why the baby had achieved the sleep habits of a retired poet. Doctors, still dazzled by laudanum's adult popularity, recommended opium-laced syrups without hesitation. These were sold everywhere: pharmacies, general stores, even through the early mail-order catalogues. Labels were beautifully decorated with floral designs, soothing fonts, and confident promises such as harmless remedy for all infant discomfort. Harmless was doing heavy lifting here. Babies became lethargic, breathing slowed, feeding routines collapsed. But because Victorian society rewarded babies who were quiet, parents celebrated these effects as signs of good temperament rather than chemical sedation. Then came teething powders, widely believed to ease the agony of erupting baby teeth. The Victorians were convinced teething caused nearly every illness: fevers, rashes, seizures, diarrhea, convulsions of the brain, and dramatic crying spells that threatened to ruin the family's reputation. So they turned to powders containing, you guessed it, mercury. Yes, mercury, the shimmering metal we now fear with appropriate horror. Back then it was considered a powerful calming agent, and calm it did. Babies grew quiet, very quiet, often concerningly quiet. But again, quietness was treated as a virtue, not a symptom. Mercury poisoning crept silently into nurseries. Children showed signs of irritability, digestive distress, skin discoloration, weakened limbs, and in severe cases, developmental delays. But Victorian families rarely blamed the powders, they blamed teething itself, or the weather, or mischievous spirits. Anything except the fact that they were spoon-feeding heavy metals to infants. These were not fringe practices, they were mainstream. Doctors recommended them, nurses encouraged them, parenting manuals endorsed them. And newspapers printed advertisements with angelic drawings of babies sleeping peacefully, though one could argue the babies were less sleeping peacefully and more temporarily absent from consciousness thanks to narcotics. Yet the fads didn't stop there. Victorian parents also embraced strict punishing routines designed to mould children into miniature adults as quickly as possible. Infants were expected to follow rigid feeding schedules that ignored hunger cues. Some manuals insisted babies should be fed only at specific times, regardless of their needs. Crying outside those hours was to be ignored, because responding risked spoiling the child, a fear roughly equal to modern anxieties about screen time. Fresh air was considered essential, but only if controlled with precision. Babies were often placed outdoors in prams or cradles for airing, even in cold weather. Some parents believed drafts were healthy, others believed drafts were deadly. The result was a chaotic mix of children bundled like Arctic explorers or left lightly wrapped on balconies while snowflakes drifted nearby. Parents nodded approvingly and congratulated themselves on building resilience. Sleep routines were equally strict. Infants were put to bed alone in dark rooms to train their nerves. Toys were discouraged. Smiling too much at the baby was discouraged. Talking to the baby was discouraged, unless the topic was morality. Emotional warmth was considered potentially destabilizing to the child's developing character, so Victorian nurseries often teetered between stoic discipline and desperate guesswork. Illness, when it struck, inspired its own arsenal of fads. Some parents applied mustard plasters to chests, believing they drew out sickness, though they mostly drew out alarming skin reactions. Others used goose grease rubs, onion poultices, or vinegar compresses. A few resorted to bloodletting for children, though doctors increasingly frowned on this, which says a lot given what else Victorian doctors were recommending. The wealthier classes had access to professional advice, though professional in the Victorian sense meant doctors who insisted children required cold sponge baths for fever, brisk walks for fatigue, or purgatives for absolutely anything that looked like a digestive issue. Middle-class families often relied on manuals or the stern opinions of hired nurses. Working-class families depended on neighbour wisdom, folk cures, or whatever substance was cheapest at the apothecary, usually the ones filled with alcohol. And despite all this, Victorian children did survive, though many faced health complications that readers today would recognise as preventable. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Many of the normal treatments contributed more harm than relief, yet none of it was done out of cruelty. Parents were doing what everyone around them believed was best. They trusted experts, tradition, and advertisements. They followed advice because the stakes were high and the alternatives felt terrifying. As the late Victorian era progressed, reforms slowly emerged. The rise of germ theory, Improved medical training and growing professional nursing standards gradually pushed harmful remedies aside. Mercury powders vanished from nurseries. Opium syrups faded from pharmacy shelves. Parenting advice shifted slightly toward gentler methods. But the legacy of Victorian child health fads remains one of history's clearest reminders. Good intentions can go spectacularly wrong when guided by bad information. Victorian childcare was a world built on fear, hope, improvisation, and the desperate desire for a quiet baby, no matter the cost. The Victorian era is long gone, the corsets unlaced, the arsenic wafers discontinued, the tobacco enemas mercifully abandoned, yet the ghost of Victorian health lingers around us like a polite but deeply misinformed ancestor. Many of their beliefs, habits, insecurities, and a magical thinking didn't die with the century. They simply changed outfits, learned new vocabulary, and reappeared in modern wellness culture. Some trends survived simply because no one stood up and said, maybe we shouldn't swallow poison. Victorian health culture wasn't just a cluster of eccentric practices, it was a world view, a way of interpreting the body as a moral, aesthetic, and emotional project. And we still carry fragments of that worldview today, often without realizing it. Let's start with detox culture, one of the Victorians' most persistent gifts to the modern world. Victorians were obsessed with the idea that the body accumulated impurities, miasmas, or moral stagnation that needed to be purged, drained, sweated out, or violently expelled with the help of mercury, castor oil, or vigorous hose therapy. Today's detox teas and juice cleanses aren't quite the same as Victorian bloodletting, but they spring from the same fear that health is achieved not by nourishment but by subtraction, removing toxins, flushing the system, purifying the self. Of course, modern detox products use sleek packaging and influencer partnerships instead of mercury, but the emotional appeal is identical. Victorians and modern consumers both crave the feeling of transformation, the symbolic purge, the belief that wellness can be achieved by eliminating invisible enemies. Equally enduring is the Victorian obsession with thinness, born from 19th century anxieties about morality, class, and self-discipline. Victorians believed a slender figure signalled purity, self-control, and refinement. Fatness, by contrast, was associated with weakness, gluttony, and low status. These ideas embedded themselves deeply in Western culture, resurfacing again and again in different forms: flapper thinness in the 1920s, diet culture in the 1980s, wellness culture today. Modern society may no longer worship Lord Byron's vinegar diet, but the pressure to achieve a certain body shape, or to treat weight as a moral achievement, has Victorian fingerprints all over it. The language even echoes the past. Clean eating, disciplined lifestyle, controlling cravings, all concepts a Victorian health lecturer would applaud with smug enthusiasm. Another legacy lies in beauty ideals, especially the belief that beauty equals health. Victorian women pursued pale skin as proof of purity, moral superiority, and fragility, ideals that echo today in subtler ways. The idea that youthfulness equals virtue, or that beauty requires constant discipline, didn't simply evaporate. It shape-shifted. Today's skincare regimens, anti-aging routines, and self-care industries may be rooted in science, but the emotional foundation, fear of aging, admiration of effort, and the need to work on oneself, has Victorian roots. The Victorians also gifted us the persistent idea that women's health is fragile, mysterious, and fundamentally different in nature from men's. Victorian doctors believed women's bodies were governed by emotion, hormones, and moral sensitivity. They insisted women were prone to nervous exhaustion and hysteria or delicate constitutions. Sound familiar? Modern women still face misdiagnoses, dismissal of pain, stereotypes of emotional instability, and gendered expectations about health and resilience. Victorian medical culture didn't disappear. It simply adapted its vocabulary. Even the Victorian obsession with natural remedies still thrives today. Hydropathy's cold plunges now appear on wellness influencer pages. Herbal tonics resurfaced as supplements. Homeopathy still survives, relying on the same comforting ritual of tiny pills and wishful thinking. Mesmerism gave way to modern forms of energy healing. Aromatherapy, crystal work, and guided trances carry echoes of 19th century magnetic fluid mysticism, only now with better lighting and scented candles. Then there's the Victorian belief in health as status, a trend that has only grown. In the 1800s, attending spas, drinking rare mineral waters, or hiring personal homeopaths signalled a class and refinement. Today, expensive fitness classes, boutique wellness retreats, and premium supplements serve similar purposes. Health in both eras became a performance, something demonstrated, displayed and Instagrammed, or sketched in a diary with artistic shading. The wealthy set the trends, everyone else scrambled to follow. Even the Victorian tendency to connect moral character with health habits persists. They believed good people exercised self-control, avoided indulgence, and monitored their bodies carefully. Today's culture still assigns moral weight to dietary choices, exercise routines, and perceived discipline. The judgment may be quieter, but it's there, a faint Victorian whisper behind every good food, bad food label. And perhaps the most enduring Victorian legacy is fear. Fear of illness, fear of imperfection, fear of aging, fear of losing vitality, beauty, social standing and purpose. Victorians lived in a world of uncertainty, industrial upheaval, and limited medical knowledge. Modern life is not so different. We have more science, but no less anxiety. So we turn to wellness fads, miracle cures, lifestyle plans, and elaborate routines, not always because they work, but because they create the illusion that we're in control. Of course, not all Victorian health ideas were misguided. Some nudged society toward better hygiene, structured exercise, and organised medical care. Some encouraged rest, nutrition, fresh air, and gentler treatments. And others, like the eventual acceptance of germ theory, reshaped the world for the better. But the darker, stranger threads of Victorian thinking never fully unravelled. They survive in the products we buy, the diets we fear, the beauty we chase, the guilt we carry, and the self-improvement projects we cling to. The legacy of Victorian health isn't just a museum display of odd devices and dusty bottles. It's woven quietly into the fabric of modern wellness, part cautionary tale, part mirror, part reminder that even the most confidently promoted health trends can be wrong in spectacular fashion. So the next time you encounter a detox drink, a miracle diet, or a wellness fad that promises total transformation, remember, the Victorians would have bought it too, and they would have swallowed it, poison aftertaste and all, with a dignified nod.